it's good to hear that bell. That bell is, I think I've already done the Pavlovian explanation, but it just makes me want to learn.
The other thing I just realized, and I do not know how it took me this long to figure this out. So we record on Friday nights. I don't know if we've ever mentioned that before, but that now makes me know that that's the weekend. That's my bell for the
Yeah,
weekend.
that's a good point. It does feel pretty nice. Man who just made that very astute observation, he's really the only person I'd ever want to do this with. He is the Paul von Hindenburg to my Ludendorff. He's the George to my Lenny. I had one more of these and I forgot it. But yeah, that's
Those two
Professor
were
Chris.
exceptionally kind, sir. Thank you very much. What's going on, everyone? We have apparently danced around this topic over the last 2 years more times than I actually can go back and count. Yeah. And I don't know if it just seemed like it was such a big topic, we weren't really sure how to approach it. And then finally we were just like, it's been long enough, we just need to dive in and try to do what we can out of this. Well,
I think we did the fun one first, honestly.
The European theater for World War II.
Well, I just think World War II in general has to be the more fun war than World War One, and we were talking about it just in getting ready for this. And Chris pointed out that this was like the first time that old warfare met new warfare.
Yeah, I feel like this war was the transitional period between like medieval style warfare, both in like weapons but also in tactics. And then it introduced, by the end of this, pretty much all of the shit that made World War II so interesting from like a warfare standpoint of like bombers, tanks, all the mechanized armies and stuff like that. That is all from World War One. That's where it's essentially created, refined, and then by the end of it, everyone knows what direction they're heading in as far as warfare goes. And so I don't. It's not the beta test for World War II, but in a way, it kind of is. It's the trial and error.
Yeah, a little bit. I would definitely think that that's a pretty good way to look at it. To dumb it down as easy as possible, World War One wasn't a strategic victory. World War One was kind of like just sort of jamming it in where it fits and pumping away. Mm-hmm. Whereas World War Two, you kind of had to have a little foreplay. There was some caressing going on. Because World War One was, we're going to dig a hole, you're going to dig a hole, one of us is going to pop up, the other one's going to fire their machine gun at us.
But that wasn't the intention.
No,
they did not foresee it becoming that. And
Yeah.
that's only a small section of it, because when you do think World War One, you think in the trenches, trench warfare, that kind of thing. That is a big part of World War One, but it's in the span of the area in which it encompasses. Yep. It's very, very small. There's so much other shit going on. And this is definitely not an undersell for World War One. I think just World War II being more current and closer. Had there not been a World War II, World War One would have been just as interesting, because it's the first time you're ever seeing this. World War II is just this war dialed up, so it's going to seem a little more interesting. But the fact that I apparently had not looked as deep into World War One as I thought I did throughout this studying, we found out pretty quickly that this was going to need to be split up into 2 episodes.
Yeah.
So, first episode, we're going to go ahead and basically cover the first 2 years of the 4 years of World War One, and then be finishing that up in next week's episode. Before we get into it, remember, guys, rate, review, subscribe, follow. If you use YouTube, we don't have a video component yet, but we're still on YouTube. I don't know if we mentioned that. Follow us on all our socials. And you got anything else to add before we jump into this?
No, let's strap our boots on.
Okay, so going back to the Franz Ferdinand episode, which if you haven't listen to that episode. I'm not saying stop and go back and listen to it, but maybe stop and go back and listen to it, because we're going to discuss essentially very shortly, the assassination. But knowing kind of the state of everything and what leads up to this it just adds a little bit more to it.
Yeah, it's kind of, this will be like the last 2 minutes of the fourth quarter with the Franz Ferdinand debate, or I guess the talk. And really, it is an important thing because it's kind of like when the wick was lit, when the fuse was lit, but there was a lot of things that had been happening beforehand that just kind of kept trimming the fuse down.
It's like you're in a bar and you see someone walk by somebody else, and they just literally might bump them, they might spill their drink a little bit, and the person whose drink they spilled is just out looking for a fucking fight, and just turns around and is like, "What the fuck?" And he's like, "Oh, sorry, man. Like, I'll get you another drink or something like that." He's like, "No, fuck you. Let's go outside." That's, I think, how Europe was. It was just Europe was looking for an excuse, or certain parts of Europe were looking for an excuse, any excuse, to be like, "Let's fucking pop this thing off."
I do think, and maybe I'm wrong on this, I think everybody that was looking for the fight hadn't just had to deal with Napoleon. And so maybe they were itching with a little bit of aggression. In France and England and everybody that had to deal with Napoleon were like, no, we're not fucking doing this again.
Yeah.
Like, let's maybe not do this.
Shit's been good for a while
Yeah.
on our side.
Yep.
For a while. We like the status quo. We're not looking to change shit up.
We sent him to an island. He hung out and did his thing. We've been fairly peaceful since then. Hey, this is actually pretty nice.
Yeah.
Like, this is almost before the military-industrial complex really got figured out, which industrialization that did happen during this time changed that whole game.
So, back on the 20th of June, 1914, Franz Ferdinand, who is the Archduke of Austria-Hungary, is assassinated by a Bosnian, I guess you would consider Bosnian freedom fighter.
Yeah, extremist maybe.
Extremist, Gavrilo Princip. Now, because of the assassination, he actually was not the next in line for the Austria-Hungary throne, but because he was essentially so important politically that there had been this animosity kind of stewing between this country, Serbia, and Austria-Hungary. Basically, Serbia had gained its independence from Austria-Hungary, so there was some bad blood there. But there was also a section of their people that still were in what would be considered nowadays like Bosnia-Herzegovina.
Yeah.
And they kind of were enticing them, or being like, hey, you guys should get a taste of this freedom shit, and like maybe not come over to our country, but rebel where you're at, and then we can absorb and have this larger country of our like peoples together.
Yeah, they were hoping to create a Southern Slavic state, and to create that. This is, I think, where the birth of nationalism kind of comes from, and it scares me a little bit because there's like nationalism and patriotism. Patriotism, I think, to me is like, hey, I'm proud to be an American, but I know that we did some. Yep. But I know at the same time, like, we're not perfect and we're not number one. Whereas nationalism is like, we are number one no matter what the fuck we do.
One of them is an educated pride. Mm-hmm. The other one is a delusional obsession.
Yeah, you want to be the best and you want to be number one instead of just being happy to be where you're from and knowing that maybe that's not the best country that there is.
Yeah, everyone's got fucking skeletons.
So I think Austro-Hungary was trying to push more of the nationalism, whereas Serbia was trying to bring together a state based upon ethnicity, culture, whereas Austro-Hungary wanted land, and that was kind of where the push and shove came from. Gavrilo was a member of something called the Black Hand, who had its starts in Serbia. One of the things that Austro-Hungary did, because this did happen in their country, is they went to Serbia and they gave them a list of demands. Shit that ran along the lines of, we need to investigate this, we want to have occupation in your country, we want to basically kind of bully you into giving us what we want.
We want to start kind of like slipping a leash back on you guys.
Yeah.
And then maybe if we do this subtly enough, we can get the collar on and then have you guys back in our fold.
Well, and this is a situation where it feels like, even though Hungarian Empire was much, well, maybe not much bigger than Germany, because Germany actually surprised me around this time. But Germany was kind of a big dick. They supported Austro-Hungary. But with Serbia, you had the Russians. I guess the Russians consider themselves Slavic somehow too.
Yeah, so the Russians are like the patriarch of like the Slavic people.
Okay.
And so when we were talking during the Stalin episode, you know how Stalin was actually Georgian, but anybody born in what was considered Russia at that time, they're Russian. That's what defined them as a Russian, is being there in Russia,
Okay.
not being from Russia and being somewhere else. So they kind of had that thing where if they had a shared peoples, which is very strange to me to think about how you have other peoples in between you and your shared peoples,
Yeah.
but like they maintained the culture once they got separated, however many years it was.
Well, it's like Little Italy, or Chinatown, anything like
Yeah.
that. Like they wanted to create their own sense of home.
Yeah.
Which I get and I understand.
So basically, Russia was like the big brother to Serbia. They also liked the fact that Serbia, them kind of protecting Serbia, they also got like exports, they got, stuff like that
Yeah.
from them. And then they also had access because I believe Serbia was a little bit closer down by like the Mediterranean and everything.
Serbia's got oil. Serbia's got what we need, even though that wasn't a big deal to Russia at the time because they were still trying to figure out how to farm. Mm-hmm. Well, I guess you would say.
Well, here's the thing too, is this is basically kind of the end of the age of the empire.
Yeah.
So during this time frame, there are still legitimate empires in the world, like the British Empire. This is still when Britain controlled Australia, New Zealand, large chunks of Africa.
India?
Controlled. It was colonized India, and so they had a huge empire. In fact, at one point, I think they said that the empire of Britain encompassed 20% of all habitable land on the planet.
Jesus Christ.
So, I mean, big fucking chunk. Here's something else that was crazy, is when you look at a World War One or pre-World War One map of Africa, there are no African countries as far as how we know them today. There are just the names of French, whatever they called it, British, whatever they called it, German. Africa was just carved up by like these three countries. And we're probably not going to talk a ton about like the fighting in Africa, but I was like, why are they sending guys? When I was kind of looking at this, I'm like, why are they sending guys into Africa and everything? They were already there in their territories, but their territories were fucking touching each other. So they had German territories that were up against British or French held territories. And so there were basically just like the representatives and the Germans down there fighting against the British down there. And so it was almost like a larger scale version of like the European theater.
Yeah, it was like I don't know, I would call them like chess moves down. Or whereas Europe was like chess, I think Africa was like checkers.
Yes.
But they were also very important because they were getting resources from those areas and sending up. And like you say, the ending of the large land holding kind of dynasties that they had everywhere else, you wanted to keep that land. That was still very important to you. But at the same time, once we leave this and Germany loses all of their possessions and everything like that, it kind of seems like we start to take a step back from...
It kind of wears everyone out on the empire because imagine you're in Australia, you're in New Zealand, Britain also controls part of Canada at this point. When they end up declaring war, they call up everybody.
Yeah.
And they're like, we need people for fucking war. If you're over in Australia and New Zealand, you're like, what the fuck, mate? Like, you guys are all the way fucking up there starting shit. We have no say in this. So now we have to come up and fucking fight in your messes. People in Canada are like, no way. Like, we don't want to do that. And so I think this really shows, this is a prime example of what happens to all these places that are outside the empire but still under control of them when a few individuals are making decisions that really affect them in horribly negative ways as far as getting a ton of their people killed. This is where you start to see the rise of the nation state, where basically instead of having, France that controls French Polynesia, French Indochina, all that kind of area, you're going to start having these areas start to kind of become independent to where they're no longer the holdings of these larger, powerful countries. because they don't want to adhere to the same rules and everything. They're like, we need our own shit here. Like we're a people here. Like we should be ruling ourselves.
Yeah, that and maybe like, hey, we'll help you out a time or two, but if you fuckers send us to anywhere like Gallipoli again, we're gonna revolt.
Yeah.
That and I do think with what Ireland was getting up to at a certain point during this, and I think for kind of most of it, I think seeing that pushback may have been, and granted, Britain still took part of Northern Ireland and really fucked them over, but I think we see a lot of the reason that these empires break up is because we have situations like what happened in Russia with the fall of the Tsarship, what happens in Austro-Hungary when it breaks up, the Ottoman Empire falling. Once those empires fall, I think everybody kind of sees it like, oh shit, maybe if we're not focused on the empire work and we have to fight in these wars, they're going to revolt and then we're going to lose. Because that was a flat tire to most of these empires.
Oh yeah, definitely. So basically, Serbia's like, hey, we're gonna go ahead and we'll fulfill all of these conditions that you sent us, except one. We're not gonna basically allow you guys carte blanche to come in and do an investigation of Serbia, because frankly, that would be like the Black Hand wasn't exactly a government sponsored organization or anything like that. And you're basically asking the government of an independent nation, because an extremist committed an act, to basically hand over the keys of their government and oversight in order for you to find out if the government had anything to do with it. So Serbia's like, no, that's like just taking steps back as far as our independence go. So at that point, Austria-Hungary is like, you know what, fuck it, we're going to war, and declares war on Serbia.
Well, a big part of that too was Austro-Hungary went to Germany like, hey man, if we want to approach this the way that we want to approach this, we're going to need your support. And Germany's like, blank check. We'll give you whatever you want. You have our support.
So Franz Joseph and the Kaiser of Germany at this time, Kaiser Wilhelm II, they were boys. They were related, actually.
Everybody is fucking
Everyone was related,
story.
including the Tsar of Russia.
Yep.
So the Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany was actually the grandson of Queen Elizabeth of Britain, and was like the cousin of Franz Joseph of Austria-Hungary. So yeah, some weird relation type shit here, but again,
the Habsburgs were at work at this point in time.
Again, it's fucking Europe, so it's a European bathhouse just on fucking steroids is what it is. Everyone's got their eyes closed and just fumbling around in the dark. So as we get into this, I want to kind of first introduce the players and kind of explain where the kind of the vibe is and the status is of Europe and these countries that are going to be involved in the bulk of the war.
It's not good.
No. So we'll go ahead and start with the one we just talked about. We'll start with Austria-Hungary. Now you have these select 5 countries that are basically what are known as the great powers, and then you have a couple come in that are the lesser powers. So starting with the great powers, we have Austria-Hungary. Now at this point, Austria-Hungary is like pretty much an ancient empire. It goes back further than I think 500 to 600 years. During that time, they were ruled by the Habsburgs, which had been in power for, I think, pretty close to that same time.
Probably.
And had interbred enough that it genetically gave them a Habsburg trait. The chin. Was it the chin or the nose?
I think it was both.
The chin and the nose. So yeah, fun stuff there. Now, they were currently being ruled by, the guy we've talked about, Franz Joseph. And the thing about Austria-Hungary that kind of leads to them not being as strong of a nation and kind of on a decline is, although during their time they have been able to absorb all of these other nations, going back to nationalism, these other countries still had their own identities. And enough so to where there were they want to say between 12 and 17 different ethnic groups that were living within this country that spoke a non-unified language, didn't have unified forms of like measurement, all that kind of stuff. They were all kind of doing their own thing. So as a nation, if you're wanting to control everybody, you got to send out like your fucking national proclamations in like 15 different languages, 15 different flyers. And if it comes time to go to war, you now have all these people that you're pulling in to form your army that are speaking different languages. So it essentially makes you pretty ineffective as a fighting force when it's herding cats, basically. You're maybe kind of herding them in the same direction, but they're just fucking going every which way.
Well, and also at the same time, your overbearing presence with all these different minority groups, they're not really going to be pumped to be a part of the empire. So,
Some of them want to fucking probably go to
yeah,
Serbia,
yep,
even at that point. So the population of Austria-Hungary at this time was about 53 million.
huge by any stretch back then, I think.
Some are going to be bigger than others. So we'll jump over to their big brother, Russia. So Russia, for the last 300 years,
Big
has
Brother Austro-Hungary was,
Germany.
yeah,
Oh, sorry. Yeah, we'll go to Germany then. Big brother of Austria-Hungary is going to be Germany. So they were a constitutional monarchy. So they weren't essentially just based on the Kaiser. He was more than a figurehead a little bit. I think he had power over the military, and then essentially the constitution of the Reichstag. Call back to what was essentially destroyed by Hitler. They had the Reichstag, and that's who kind of did more of like the governing for everything.
Germany was fucking cool back then too.
They were brand fucking new. I had no fucking
Yep.
clue.
They were the hot new girl on the street in Europe.
So this is 1914. We're talking here. Germany had only been around as a country for like 43 years up to this point. They were established in 1871, so they're new as shit. So basically how Germany came together is during what was called the Franco-Prussian War, and this will explain animosities between France and Germany, is France and Prussia, which makes up the bulk of what's going to become Germany, go to war. France is the most powerful nation in Europe up to this time. I think they were the most powerful nation in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. They were the central dominant power. They were the big dick swinging. They end up getting whooped by Prussia. And because they get beat, Prussia takes their hand into French territory and takes this place called Alsace-Lorraine. And so they have some French territory. And because of this war, basically the Chancellor of Prussia, Otto von Bismarck, is able to take this conglomeration of kind of these like-minded or what they would consider Germanic peoples and form them into the German Empire. So Prussia's kind of like the lead dog in this, but they're all Germany at this point.
Yeah.
They had fucking hit the ground running. They already had, I think, the second largest economy
Second largest economy, I think, is.
in Europe.
I want to say it might even been the top economy
Yeah, it may have been.
because it was they were coming up with all sort. When the Industrial Revolution kicks off during this time, everybody else has to try to switch over. But the thing that the Germans have a head up on everybody is they don't have to retrofit everything. They can just build everything up from scratch.
Yeah.
So you're not having that transition period. You're just having a creation period. They grew into the Industrial Revolution with factories and kind of the like very, very quickly. In a social setting, the Reichstag actually sounds like it was pretty good. They had set up social safety nets for people. And it seems like the culture was good because it was new and it was gaining power. And also you kind of had a little bit of that nationalism flair. But all these people weren't like put together against their will. It kind of seems like there was a lot of unity in Germany, which sounds like a very weird thing, a weird concept.
A very juxtaposed viewpoint to essentially their buddy, Austria-Hungary.
Yep.
This period is what's known essentially as the Second Reich. So that's where you get, after this, you get Hitler wanting to establish the Third Reich.
No Reich has ever sounded good to me, but this actually sounds pretty sweet.
Yeah, when they first form. So their population is about 65 million. They started, essentially, Kaiser Wilhelm, who was the head of this point. So you had Otto von Bismarck, who was the chancellor of Prussia, which you think, well, if that was the biggest and strongest country, you think he would be, the Kaiser, whatever. He was kind of sharing power, and then basically Kaiser Wilhelm kind of forced him out of power, and I don't think he really put up a fight. So Wilhelm is like, okay, we just ended up beating the strongest power in Europe, France, so let's start fucking, keep gearing up. So he basically wants to build a naval fleet that rivals Britain, which is pretty fucking a big deal because Britain has the largest navy in the world, and is basically their empower is predicated on naval strength. So Britain's kind of looking at them doing this, being like, what are you over there doing, motherfucker? We just saw you beat France, so we're probably already a little bit concerned at this point. They also, because they were a newly formed country, they missed out on the fucking colonizational mania that had happened in the hundreds of years prior for places like Britain and France and even Spain. Um, Germany's like, fuck, since we weren't really an established country, we don't have a lot of like holdings outside of Europe. They had a few places in Africa. I think they had like Samoa.
They had New Guinea, Samoa. They had a spot in China. This is where I think I got a little bit confused. Maybe is this seems like a larger world war than the actual, or maybe a similar size to World War Two.
When you really branch out and see all the places that even minor engagements
Yeah.
occurred and stuff like that, or where they pulled people from,
Uh huh.
like imagine that Australia and New Zealand were at that point had already established independence. They would have been like, "Fuck that, mate. We're not fucking fighting. You guys are. We're good here."
Yeah.
Like
This is a northeast portion of the
so
the
there were
hemisphere.
peoples that got dragged into this from all over the world, despite the fact that this thing was kind of centralized to Europe. That's why essentially it was a world war because it literally affected pretty much every fucking person on the planet in one way or another.
Well, and at one point too, we'll talk about it, and this just blows me away. They like literally encircled the globe as far as like there was a freighter ship from Germany that had gone over past Japan and had ended up getting blown up in like the South Pacific by South America.
Mm-hmm.
So like we circumvented the globe in the opposite direction and we were like right just tickling making a full circle around the world.
Well, you also have places where you do callbacks, like when we were talking about did Hitler escape to Argentina and all that kind
Yeah.
of shit.
Yep.
Why were there German populations in Argentina? That's why they were essentially down there, kind of near South America, is because there were German, essentially populaces down there that had established colonies and everything. But they really missed out on essentially the colonies that they would have wanted to go after, the ones that really enriched them as a country. So they started looking at the Middle East as well. They were like, well, there's some shit down there we can probably do. Russia kind of had the same idea because they were controlling some area down there near, I think, like the Balkans.
Well, and that was their Slavic area.
Yeah. And so they're like, so Russia's looking at them. They also, Kaiser Wilhelm also built a bunch of railroads in the Middle East. And unless you have some benefits to be gained or some plans in the future, you're probably not just going to be building that shit out of the goodness of your heart. So there were some kind of indications that something might be kind of building there. Going to essentially their adversaries when this thing first pops off, we go over to what would be the. Do you want to say the word?
The Triple Entente.
The Triple Entente of France, Russia, and Britain. So the Triple Entente, and I'll probably just end up referring to them as the Allies, and then referring to what in World War II would be considered the Axis.
Yeah.
They're the Central Powers. So the Central Powers are going to be Germany, a little bit the Ottoman Empire, Austria-Hungary. Allies are going to be, for the beginning, basically, in the main portion of it, France, Russia, and Britain. We will eventually get to the United States, but that's probably going to be in episode 2.
Yeah.
Because we talked about this, despite the United States' claim to its heavy involvement in World War One, yeah, we didn't come until late. And looking back at World War Two, we kind of came in late
drug our
there
feet.
too. But we came in, we made an impact, we ended up winning, so we get to essentially claim that.
We got the save.
We're
We came in the ninth for the last 3 outs and closed out the game.
We're the guy that gets assigned to the group for the group project, disappears, doesn't do anything, comes in at the end, says, "What can I do to present? Do you guys want me to do the presentation?" They're like, "Well, you haven't looked at it." This person knocks it out of the fucking park just because they got that charisma and that presentation.
Well, it's kind of bullshit, and I don't want to start pointing fingers against America here, but there's a certain sense in this industrial revolution where America was providing stuff to both sides of this fight.
We were making money.
Yeah, yep. So
that's essentially. So America, this tidbit, pre World War One, we were a debtor nation, which means we owed money.
yeah,
We left World War One as a creditor nation. We had made so much money. I think they said it tripled or quadrupled the industrial exportations coming out of the United States for steel, food, textiles, stuff like that, war materials, and we weren't taking any of the losses because we weren't having to replace infrastructure or pay soldiers or armies and all that kind of stuff. So we were just making money from all these people that were killing each other overseas. And we left World War One essentially as the strongest economic power in the world.
It was a situation, I think, where America didn't want to be dragged into this until they absolutely had to be. Like, I'm sure it was probably the last German check that they got for materials and goods and steel. And then they knew that another one wasn't coming. So, like, all right, you're trying to get Mexico on your side. Fuck you. Stop playing around in the Western Hemisphere.
We'll talk about that.
We're coming there. Yeah.
You also have to look at it from an economic perspective. Is like, okay, at some point we're making hand over fist from this war thing, but they're gonna eventually the war is gonna stop, and if it gets to the point where everyone's fucking dead, no one's gonna be there to go and buy our shit. Yeah, if we can stop this thing at a decent point, think of how much money we'll make off the reconstruction.
Yeah. We got to keep some customers alive
Yeah,
here.
exactly. Yeah, you can't charge anyone when they're fucking dead. Well, speaking of who we're charging at this point, let's jump up to Mario London and talk about Great Britain, or essentially the United Kingdom at this point. So, United Kingdom currently under King George V. They did have the Parliament, so they had the Prime Minister, who basically held all of the power. At this point, already at the time of World War One, the British royal family, which we just kind of started discussing them a few episodes ago, they're kind of like a figurehead of state.
But I think their figuredom started pretty or like a long time before this.
Yeah. So you had this guy, the prime minister at the time was Herbert Asquith. They had a $45 million person population. They were the first ones to essentially pick up and run with the Industrial Revolution. So I think at one point, London was the financial capital of the world during the Industrial Revolution. This also allowed them to essentially process a ton of war materials. So despite being smaller as far as land masses, a little bit on the smaller side as far as population and what they were able to field for an army, they were like extremely well equipped as far as like the Navy went and everything.
Well, and they were probably a pretty sweet middleman for just being the island there that everything would probably land on to start distributing into Europe.
Well, and here's where their strength was. When they essentially get into this, it's not just the population of the United Kingdom. They're calling Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, India. Unfortunately, they did pull people from Ireland, parts of the Middle East. So all these other people that are essentially untouched by war from countries, you're calling up people that start sending them to you and start sending you resources. So although they were small as far as like landmass, they were just resources pulling in.
Well, like you said too, that's this whole triple entente kind of feels like everybody has their own power. Great Britain, obviously a traditionally large navy, but a very strong navy, who, like you said, picked up on this industrial revolution quickly. They started building bigger ships. Well, building bigger ships, they still have the stuff that they had before.
You didn't have to have a huge standing army either because...
You're an island.
No, yeah, you had what they called it like the giant moat.
Yeah.
Around Fortress Britain. But yeah, you only had to have enough people to defend your land. You weren't having to field soldiers to go out and conquer while at the same time defending your land.
Well,
that's where it comes in handy to be able to pull in all these troops from.
And it also comes in handy too if you're going to get in a partnership with somebody to go to someplace like France.
Yes.
France had the largest standing army in Europe, maybe even the world at that point, I guess.
Yeah, so Britain in the first part of this, when they see kind of some rumblings going on with like Serbia and all of a sudden Germany starting to perk up because they're on Austria-Hungary side, and then Russia's starting to gear up. We kind of talked about how Britain and France were just kind of like, oh, we don't like where this is going. Like, guys, everything's good over here. Please don't break it. No, don't. And it's like, they're like the husband and wife of Europe, and they're looking at the kids. They're like, they're going to fucking break everything. They're going to fucking break everything. And then we're going to have to come in and clean it up. So Britain was like, we initially are trying to stay out of this, but because of essentially just proximity to this whole thing, they really weren't in a position to initially stay out of it.
Well, and they also have to cover up for some of the Belgian promises that they had made earlier, too.
That's true. They did, although they're going to be allies with Russia, they did kind of butt heads a little bit over territory in China. because China does border Russia, and Britain had some colonies in China, so they had kind of had some arguments essentially with Russia, despite them essentially coming together in regards to this. The third member of the Triple Entente is going to be France. France is a democratic republic. After Napoleon, they're like, fuck it, no more single rulers or emperors. We're a democratic republic. They were the true democratic republic in Europe. Several prime ministers essentially during the time of World War One, so I'm not really going to name names, but France was used to being essentially, like I said before, King Dick in the locker room. They had been the central dominant power in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. This was something new for them to not essentially be top dog in Europe. And what kind of caused that was the Franco-Prussian War. So France doesn't like Germany at this point because they just recently beat them and kind of set them down a couple pegs where other countries were able to kind of surpass them as far as power goes. They had a population of 40 million, which despite them having quite a bit of land size and everything, they had one of the lower populations, even lower than essentially the United Kingdom. Now, they had a large colonial empire like Britain because they had been a traditional ancient power. In Africa, Southeast Asia, they were used to war. And like you were saying, they did have the largest standing army. And were technically, I think, one of the more well-equipped ones as well.
I think that was the difference, was they had a large standing army, but maybe they weren't as equipped as the British. So it's kind of like the British had the Navy and then the advancements. The French were still packing. They were still very good, but they had a lot of well-trained armies.
Yeah, they had veterans that had fought in the Franco-Prussian War, despite the fact they'd lost. They had an established military where they actually had like people in command that had had previous wartime experience.
Well, and then also to go along to create this just beautiful synergy of fighting power, you got to have naval superiority, check. Mm-hmm. You got to have army superiority, check. And then you need a bunch of guys. This is like if France and Britain are mom and dad, Russia is like the dumb oldest son that's super duper strong.
I was going to say the uncle, the drunk uncle. I think Russia might kind of be the drunk uncle that comes in and just fucks shit up when they have family visits. So for the last 300 years, Russia had been ruled over by the Romanov dynasty and the current czar. So essentially, they were a true monarchy. One person in power was Tsar Nicholas II. 164 million as far as the population, so they dwarf all the. It takes like adding up a couple times, like 2 or 3 of these other countries to create the population. But as far as Europe goes, they were like 4th in economic power, tons of land and everything, but they just kind of couldn't figure out how to use it. They had an extremely high percentage of its population was like just below the poverty line.
Well, and it's sort of, they almost had enough of a population and a farming history that they're like, what the fuck are you guys industrializing? Just keep farming. It's working for us. We're doing fine. But you run the risk of not industrializing.
Industrialize your farming then.
Yeah.
Make it even more productive, but it was just like, no, stuff's been working here. They also, kind of like France, were coming off of an L during its last, what it would be considered a war. They actually had the Russo-Japanese War. I think we might have touched on that in the Samurai episode, just very, very quickly, where they had actually defeated the Russian Navy. So they were coming off a loss. Because of the conditions in Russia at this point, this is when socialism is rising. This kind of goes hand in hand, if you guys have listened to the Stalin episode, when the Russian Revolution is happening and when socialism is gaining popularity, it's because essentially the conditions for the majority of the population there.
The rise in Lenin is what knocks Russia out of the war.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of like Austria-Hungary. It's a multi-ethnic empire. They're a Slavic people, which basically when they say the term Slavic, it's people that share a language and a culture. So it's not necessarily a nationality. It's just people that have a shared like language and culture. Did you know that they didn't like Britain? They disliked them so much that when Britain was kind of had control in Canada, That's why they sold Alaska to the United States,
Just
is
to
because
piss off.
they couldn't really use it because, to get across to it, you still had the Bering Strait. Or
Yeah, the
not,
land
is it?
bridge
Yeah.
land bridge got covered with water,
Yeah.
so it's not
But they couldn't really do anything in Alaska, so they were just like, we want a buffer zone between us. So they just gave it to who had previously been Britain's enemies.
and like cheap as shit
Oh
too,
yeah.
huh?
Oh yeah. So they'd done that just to kind of spite Britain, I think. And then coming in, as far as what we consider the lesser powers, are going to be the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans, we talked about them during the Constantinople episode. We talked about the Ottomans, I think, we touched on them during the Lawrence of Arabia, because
Yep.
that's where a lot of that shit was going on. They were basically down where like Constantinople, modern day Turkey is. That was the Ottoman Empire. Now, at one point, the Ottoman Empire had been one of the most powerful empires on earth, but their heyday was pretty much like the 16th and 17th century, and they were kind of like, they called them the old man of Europe.
Yeah.
They were on the decline. They had been ruled over for essentially since the inception of the empire by the House of Osman, and basically they were on the Arabian Peninsula, in North Africa, Central Europe, when they were at their peak. So they were kind of everywhere, all over Europe. At this point, they were ruled over by what they called the three Posh Triumvirate. So I guess there was some type of ruling council. And then they had a population of 18.5 million. So they were kind of slow, or
And-
they were on the smaller side of it.
Well, and I think too they were more concentrated into larger cities like Constantinople, like Damascus, like Jerusalem that they held for forever.
Yeah, they were on friendly terms with Germany, but the other countries had kind of been looking at that, Russia especially, and it's kind of like that meme where the guy's leaning out, rubbing his hands together from behind the tree. And because they had been on the decline for so long, when you start showing weakness at this time, other countries start to look at you and like, what can we carve off this country? Like, what can we go ahead and take from them? So they were looking at the Ottoman Empire being like, okay, this can be carved up for a few of us.
Let's make a new Germany.
Yeah, exactly. And then last but not least, well, probably least actually in this war, is we have Italy. So Italy was kind of in the same boat that Germany had been in. It had kind of been, a smattering of different like territories and everything. They actually all unified in 1860, so they only had 11 years on Germany as far being like a unified country. 36 million population. They were a parliamentary monarchy, so they had parliament, kind of like the way Britain does, it sounds like. This is also what allowed Mussolini to kind of start gaining power, which he does kind of after World War One, when the monarch really doesn't have any power, so he's kind of the figurehead that's installed in control of the country. Oh, and then the last one would be Serbia, which we touched on. Basically, they were a long-time empire within themselves for the longest time until the Ottoman Empire, in which they were taken over. After they were taken over by the Ottomans, they were taken over by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And then they got back to independence in 1878. Again, this is what was causing the kind of the friction between Austria-Hungary and Serbia. They only had 4.5 million people. They wanted parts of Bosnia, and again, they were protected by Russia.
How many people were in Italy? What was the Italian population?
36 million.
Okay, so a decent amount.
Yeah.
I think Italy. I'm going to start out with the things that I love about Italy: the food, the culture, just sort of the way of life that they go about things, the beautiful vineyards, different things like that. For the bad, and I don't think it's all technically their fault, Italy doesn't ever seem like they can go into a war and really affect things in a positive light. They're sort of like, they'll keep you busy, but they're not going to win a whole lot.
Not great foresight.
No. And
Not great foresight at all.
I think a lot of it comes from the fact that the Roman Empire ruled that area for so long that once the Roman Empire fell, everybody in Italy's like, well, shit, we don't have anybody telling us what to do. What do we do here?
It was the good old days.
Yeah.
Like there were people when Italy reformed into what its state was at that point down back in 1870, that they were hoping for a third Roman Empire. Like it was going to be like the new Roman Empire. So they had some pretty lofty aspirations.
They had like a for sale sign on the entire country just to be like, hey, come on, if you want to take us over, we'll deal with some light rule, but at the same time, we're still our own people.
Yep.
So they're going to clamp on to whoever does well in this situation.
So the month of July is extremely hectic and busy. The first 2 months of this are pretty much just like everybody being like, fuck you, fuck you, fuck you. Everyone's getting ready to go to war. So on the 28th, after Serbia declines to fulfill that one fucking condition, and these conditions, I think you might have mentioned it, they were kind of designed to be declined.
Yeah.
Like had they accepted them, they'd be like, oh shit, they fucking
They
all
shot
of
for the
them?
moon.
Yeah, exactly. So Austria or Austro-Hungary declares war on Serbia on the 30th of July. That was on the 28th. So on the 30th, Germany basically tells Russia and is like, you better not, don't do it. And because essentially Russia was like, they're fucking going after Serbia. So Sweden sees this, and on the 31st, Sweden's like, okay, I'm starting to see what's going on here. And they're like, we just want to let everyone know we're not part of this.
Pass.
So they make the declaration of neutrality on this. The 31st, after Germany tells them not to, Russia's like, fuck you, Germany, and starts to mobilize. August 1st, the next day, Germany's like, fuck you, we're declaring war on you. So they declare war on Russia. France sees this, and France is like, shit. So now France mobilizes and announces their army, getting their army together.
Yeah, France had a treaty with Russia. So if Russia was going to get into it, France was going to get into it. And I'm sure they were probably had a little bit of a sore ass from what the Germans had done to them previously.
Oh, 100. I think it might have been like 60% revenge and like 40% they were friendly on friendly terms, or they had a treaty with Russia.
And this, not to cut you off, this goes to my point that I make in fucking every episode about this shit. Treaties don't mean anything.
Who says in here? One of them says, the guy, the Kaiser. He even says that. I'll get to that in just a second.
Okay.
So at this point, on the 1st of August, Italy sees what's going on, and Italy's like, I'm out. I'm not going in on this. I know we said Italy was going to be one of the players, and they will be, but basically, initially, they were like, nope, I'm out.
They walk back to the bench, and we're going to see who is winning at half.
Exactly. So on August 2nd, Germany is already fucking on it. They invade Luxembourg. So it's kind of their neighboring country. If you're looking at a clock, and it's like to the 11 o'clock, maybe 10 or 11 o'clock of where Germany is at this point, kind of up toward the English Channel. On the 3rd, Germany basically tells France that it's on. So they're invading Luxembourg because what they're attempting to do is Germany and France are touching. You'd think the first place that Germany would want to go after is basically a straight shot into France to try to basically cut that off the snake. They had this plan called the Schlieffen Plan.
Mm-hmm.
And the Schlieffen Plan had been designed by this guy. He was a previous military bigwig in Germany. His last name was Schlieffen, so not clever naming there. But he basically said if they end up going to war and they need to go into France, the way to do it is to go up through Luxembourg, through Belgium, basically come in from the north above Paris, and then attack Paris from the north. This basically bypasses all the strongest places that France had instead of just a straight shot.
Well, and you're going to catch them from behind. If Paris is indeed right up there and the French troops have just left to go into Germany, you're going to run into an unoccupied Paris, which once you get Paris...
Exactly. And you're in between, even if Britain wants to try to help. Now you're in control of that area.
Well, and that was kind of the important thing, too, was because Belgium had declared their neutrality. And through a treaty with England, or Britain at the time, I guess England total, it said... well, if you're going to remain neutral, we're going to support your desire to remain neutral. So once Luxembourg is starting to fight with Germany, that immediately triggers Britain to be like, well, shit, now we got to be in this too because we have to stand pat with what we said with Belgium. And France, if you get overrun, we don't want German neighbors.
Exactly. So, yeah, Belgium basically tells Germany, they're like, stay the fuck out of our country. They asked, they're like, hey, can we just, like... move through your country into France? And they're like, no. Like, you think that you're just going to leave? They're like, well, if we damage anything, we'll pay for it. We'll take care of it. They're like, stay the fuck out of our country. Switzerland at this point is already making themselves known. They're like, fuck it, we're out. Sweden reiterates the fact that now more people are in here declaring war. They're like, just in case it wasn't clear, we're out of all of this, not just who initially was declaring war. On the 4th, after Belgium, a day after Belgium says stay out, Germany's like, nope. So they invade Belgium. And this is where I guess Belgium was correct in not letting them through just to protect their sovereignty, but even more so based upon what happened in Belgium when Germany invades. It's what comes to be known as the Rape of Belgium. And it's basically at the fucking onset, before the war is even warm, Germany is already committing like fucking war crimes and atrocities against like Belgium civilians.
And it's as bad as you think. Anytime the word rape is used in a historical context,
Anytime they're willing to put the word rape in and
yep.
to describe something, it's not fucking good. So Britain sees this and they're like, "What the fuck?" And they're like, "We have a treaty with these guys, and now because you're fucking up here, we got to come in and go against you." Well, the Kaiser basically just says, a treaty is just a scrap of paper. And so the United Kingdom at that point declares war on Germany and calls up all their homies and is like, "We're gonna need you guys to start sending us people because we're going to war with Germany." At this point, the U.S. makes its status known. It's just like, "Hey, just let everyone know we are not going to war. We will, however, be providing all interested parties at this point with a bunch of materials that they're going to need to go to war. So you just let us know what you guys need and we'll start sending it out."
We're open for business.
Oh yeah. So 5th of August we get the Battle of Liege, which is one of the first actual engagements. Austria-Hungary at this point on the 6th declares war with Russia. It's apparently it's not a given. Like, you have to actually make your declaration. So I'm going to mention a lot when different countries are declaring war on different other countries, and you're going to say to yourself, "Well, yeah, duh," but they have to actually declare war. And it's not like, since Germany and Austria-Hungary are together, when you declare war on Germany, you're also declaring war on them. You have to make each individual declaration, apparently.
Yeah, general declaration, so it's like everybody has to know. And I don't know if maybe that was just like the code back then to do it.
Yeah, because a lot of the warfare was also based on this weird code of conduct or honor or some shit like that.
Oh, and yeah, but we're talking about a time before the UN, before the League of Nations, which comes out of this. So there's no like general body that you're reporting this to. There's nobody going to be like, "No, you didn't declare war first. Technically, what you did was an invasion."
You're trying to basically say, "Well, we did declare war, so anything we did after that is under the declaration of war."
Yeah,
I think you're trying to fucking cover your ass is what you're trying to do. So
from who though? Like, war crimes weren't really a thing back then.
Well, it kind of was, because that ends up what kind of starts turning after this situation in Belgium. Anybody who was looking at Germany at this point was like, "Well, maybe Germany has a point," because at this point, this isn't like the 24-hour news cycle portion of the world that we all live in today and that we've all probably grown up in, where you can find information whenever you need it. Information travels very slow. And so when you hear about a war in Europe and Germany's attacked this country, your perception can be like, "Well, I wonder what they did," or "I wonder why they're attacking," and you might not get all of that information. When you actually hear what somebody's doing, if you had a question in your head of who the good guy is, who the bad guy is, and then you hear about this thing called the Rape of Belgium, people are going to be like, "Oh, so Germany's the bad guy in this situation." And it turns countries that are, potentially people that could be allies or enemies, people now start to have a not so good look at Germany.
Well, I do think you just brought up something that kind of tickled something in my brain a little bit. This sort of was, along with the Industrial Revolution, you get shit like the printing press.
Mm-hmm.
So this is almost like first gen social media news kind of getting out to the masses, and that also coupled with people being able to read more than they used to.
Mm-hmm.
So we're seeing the most media that's ever been in the world.
Well, what's crazy is, like, during the research, I saw like news articles in the front of like the New York Times and everything, and it was to the point where it was every story on the front page was something about this. It wasn't like this and then 18 other stories that have nothing to do with it. This was like worldwide news. So this was starting to get out. So whereas countries may have been able to get away with this shit in the past and cover up this kind of stuff, that time is kind of gone.
Yeah.
At this point.
Back then, you could go in, invade a country, take it over, and it could be yours before the news hits.
Exactly. And you're like, when the fuck did these guys get here?
Yeah.
So on the same day that Austria-Hungary declares war on Russia, Serbia declares war on Germany. The 7th of August, Spain is like, "We want to make it very known. We don't want any part of anyone's asses. We're fucking out of this whole thing." On the 8th, Sweden makes another reiteration. They're like, just in case you guys didn't hear it the first time, we are out of this. I'm sorry, Switzerland does that.
They just want their name in the
Yeah,
news.
Norway is like, yep, we're going to be with them. We're completely out of it. On the 11th, France declares war on Austria-Hungary. And then on the 12th, the United Kingdom declares war on Austria-Hungary. And the British Expeditionary Force, which is basically what they considered the British Army at the time, they actually land in Europe.
It's weird that they went Expeditionary Force, American lands the American Expeditionary Force. Like, just say that you're showing up over there. It's not an expedition.
Yeah, it's your fucking army.
Yeah, you're going to war.
Yeah, don't fucking try to like be clever about it.
You're not landing 1 million people in
You're
a country.
doing that for PR to make people think that joining up, you're like, oh, it's an expedition. It'll be exciting.
Yeah.
We heard about Teddy Roosevelt's expeditions. They seem like they're fun.
He ain't fighting bears this time.
So we come to the 17th of August, and we get the Battle of Stolyaponin. Basically, this is the first battle in the East. That's the only reason I mention it. And during this time, just assume that if we're not discussing battles, because if you look up the timeline of World War One, it's constant with all of it. We can't discuss every single one. We're just going to try to hit some key points that will explain essentially what changes the trajectory or what stalls the war. So we're really only going to hit some of the major points of this. If we tried to do it all, this would be a fucking 15-part podcast.
Yeah, we're going to talk about the wars, but not really in depth. I just really wanted to try to drive home because this scares me to no end. And I think maybe this is why we're more comfortable learning about World War II than World War I. Just for the simple fact that the amount of casualties that happen in these battles are just numbers that are unfucking heard of. I think I was maybe 2 or 3 days into research and I texted you, I was like, how is there anybody left in Europe?
I know. It went from, because the warfare advanced so quickly with new weapons, it went from like cavalry with guys pulling out the sabers and charge and all that shit. It advanced so quick in the deadliness of weapons that the tactics were the same for when they would do like pitched battles and charges and stuff like that, when they were used to like musket fire and someone being able to shoot off like 2 or 3 muskets within a minute period to fucking machine guns that throw out 600 rounds per minute. So the tactics, it took a while for the tactics to actually compensate for what the fucking weaponry could do. And it just leads to, when you compare the wars before this and look at the numbers of casualties and you jump straight to this, it's not even a gradual, like, oh, I can see the increase. It spikes from like fucking the onset. So Russia actually enters into what is considered Germany into Prussia at that point. So Russia's already at their line and moving in. The 20th, we get the Battle of, and this is kind of one of, these are the early engagements, and this is kind of what sets the tone, which is why we're going to be a little bit more specific in discussing these ones. The Battle of Gumbinnen, which is a Russian win, so they're already setting the tone there. And on the 23rd of August, just to make sure no one's feeling left out, Japan's like, oh, by the way, we declare war on Germany as well. On that day as well, you have, I'm sorry, I'm going to jump back to the day before, the 22nd. We get this thing called the Battle of the Frontiers. And the term battle, it takes on a weird non-meaning in World War I because they're referring to battles, and some of these last a couple days, some of these last 9 months, and they're considered the battles because they take place in a centralized location. So you get this thing called the Battle of the Frontiers, which is actually a whole string of engagements, but this is kind of when it starts.
Yeah, I think I might label it as the Frontier Wars because it just felt like there were little mini...
That's probably a more apt term for it. So during the Frontier Wars, in one day, this is going to kind of set the tone for casualties. In one day, France loses 27,000 of its soldiers killed in a single day. That is up to that point, that was the largest single loss. To put it almost into perspective, I think Gettysburg was a 3-day battle, and I think they lost 7,000 was the amount of dead between both the Union and Confederacy.
And that was a holy shit number for the Civil War. Like that was a big, big loss.
So 27,000 French soldiers killed in one day.
Well, and the Frontier Wars, these are the French and the Germans going at each other. And the French end up getting pushed back. They got pushed back because over the entirety of these frontier wars that happened, over the weeks that happened, France ended up losing 329,000 people to Germany losing 256,000 people.
How does
That
that not just put a fucking pin in it and leadership of both countries being like, ooh, we did not see these numbers happening.
And again, that's not all deaths; those are casualties, but those are just essentially people getting pushed out of the war.
Yeah, if this is your first time listening to one of our war podcasts, essentially a casualty is not mean that they were killed. A casualty means you're essentially knocked out of the fight. So you're either injured or killed.
Yeah.
But essentially you're unable to make war is what they consider a casualty.
The Brits lost at Mons on August 23rd. They're pushed back into France. We get to what's called the Battle of Marne. The Battle of Marne went from September 6th to the 12th, and the British counterattack during the Battle of Marne saves Paris. Each side, again, racks up 250,000 casualties. 250,000 casualties. 500,000 people get lost.
Each.
Yeah.
Yeah, they got within 40 miles of Paris. So the Germans were that close to reaching Paris. Yeah, the Allies, they dug in 40 miles and they started pushing them back. Now, when they pushed them back to a point, and as Germany is coming through Belgium, they're moving their troops up to try to, take territory and take land and push toward Paris.
Yeah.
What they're also doing, though, is they understand to a degree that part of this war will also be defensive. And if it ends up coming to an armistice or a stalemate, war is one of those things where it's like, well, if we currently occupy it, it's ours now, right?
Yeah.
So as Germany is moving forward, as they're pushing, they're also leaving people behind to establish fortifications to where if they do get pushed back by a counterattack, they're not getting chased all the way back into German territory. They have a fallback position in which they can then hold that to then make other attacks to try to push from a new territory.
They're not repeating back into just their other areas. They're retreating back to fortification.
Yep. So jumping over to the Eastern Front on the 23rd of August, a few weeks before, you get the first major German win against the Russians at the Battle of Tannenberg. And this is going to essentially make the names of a couple people that are going to have fucking pretty big parts to play. You might recognize a couple of these names if you listen to the Hitler episodes. The two people in charge, essentially, of the Battle of Tannenberg on the German side, you have Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg, who eventually goes on to become the Chancellor and President of Germany during Adolf Hitler's rise. You then have his second in command, a guy named Erich Ludendorff. And again, weirdly enough, Ludendorff plays a hand in the ascension of Hitler, almost serving as the figurehead of Hitler's socialist movement for a time.
He was the big part of the pooch. He was a big part of when they ran into the beer hall. He was supposed to be the guy that brought everybody into
Legitimacy.
the fold.
Give it legitimacy. Yep. So these two guys are the military commanders, and basically during this battle, Germany wins very convincingly, enough to the point where they take 90,000 Russian prisoners. That's who they took prisoner. That's not saying the casualties also they inflicted to the Russians at that point. But already at the start of this war, you already just lost 90,000 of your soldiers. And chances are, too, those soldiers were the ones that you're probably establishing as those aren't the new guys that you just trained. Those are the established soldiers that you probably have. And you're losing, at that point, experience as well. We kind of move over to where, there's so many different things going on. Eastern Front, Western Front. You're going to start seeing things happen down in the Middle East. So we're going to kind of jump around. We might get ahead on one front in the dates and then have to switch to another front and go back in the dates to let you know what's going on. So we'll try to be as good as we can about that, not too confusing.
Yeah, there's just so many things that are happening at the same time that it's really tough to kind of sink in on one front, just bouncing back and forth, because everything is happening all at the same time. You have August 28th when the sea wars actually open up. Britain is the one that draws first blood. They first sink 3 German cruisers at a place called Heligoland Bight.
Mm-hmm. So thinking about it from a perspective of like geography, Germany doesn't have a ton of access to the ocean.
What is it, the Rhine? The Rhine gets them out to the sea, and then the sea.
Yep, into like it's not I don't it's like the English Channel or whatever that's called, and then you could get above England to the North Sea.
Yeah.
But they essentially have to then at some point sail past Britain either north or south through the channel. So when they're constructing these ships, and they do actually construct a pretty sizable navy at this point, it's not super comparable to Britain, but it's large in its own right and pretty powerful. They're staying kind of close to German territory because if you're a British warship and you go out and into the Atlantic, Britain is pretty close. You can sail north and you can come back around to it. If you go out there as the German Navy and you get damaged or something, you don't have friendly ports until you're having to sail back past hostile territory to get there. So they're kind of keeping their navy kind of closer to home. So this battle actually takes place kind of over off the coast of like either Germany or France. Like Adam said, they sink 3 German cruisers, and this kind of gives Britain a chance to start getting a foothold in a blockade of Germany. This war is going to happen on so many different fronts, and what I mean militarily, but I also mean economically, and to try to basically starve Germany from being able to, make war. Germany's getting a lot of supplies in overseas.
Oh, yeah.
Both from their territories and then also from other countries.
America.
A ton of them. Yeah. A lot of their food is coming in as well. So Britain starts to establish a blockade to stop any ships from getting into, and any shipments getting into German hands. Enough so to the fact where they go to the United States and they're like, hey, just so you guys know, no shipments are going to Germany, but we'll go ahead and buy all those shipments from you guys. So you guys will still be making money, but just so you know, nothing's going to Germany. Do we understand? America's like, well, yeah, if you're buying all this stuff again, it doesn't really hurt us.
We'll sell it twice. Yeah, that's cool.
So, yeah, go ahead.
It's so much more, I think, of it's going to hurt the military, but at the same time, you're hurting everybody at home, too, because you're still getting those imports of food and everything that all of the civilians need, too.
We're going to get into the revolutions that take place within these countries, and that's part of, I think, the method is, like, if we can incite rebellion and strife at home, it's going to have to draw their resources back just to try to maintain control of their own countries.
The fucking Germans, man. The Germans figured it out quick, too. And the Germans, I don't know, do you have anything why England didn't start trying U-boats and submarines?
So Britain actually developed the submarine.
Really?
They were like the proprietors of the submarine. But what Germany saw, kind of like they did in World War II, is they were like, in order for us to get on parity with Britain, we can try to match them as far as like warships and things like that, battleships, cruisers, but they do also have the experience on us as well from design perspectives. We can manufacture, just like in World War II, a shit ton of U-boats for the same cost and materials as these big battleships. And they found out that they can be just as effective. And in Germany, kind of thinking the same way Britain did, of saying like, if we do have to end up fighting Britain on this thing, we can maybe establish a little blockade of our own and start using U-boats to target merchant ships and starve Britain of supplies. So they kind of had a similar idea, just a different way of going about it.
Well, the U-boats were so revolutionary because I want to say that they had like an 8,000 mile range that they could go out in.
Like 8 or 9, yeah.
Yeah, so you're going to be able to spread these things out pretty far. And if you're going to run a blockade on England, they weren't submarines in the fact that like they could spend all day underwater. It was I want to say it was like 95% of the time they were above water.
Yeah.
But when you need to attack or anything like that, if you can dip down for a while, they were run by batteries, which again, I don't know how in the fucking 1915 they had figured out battery power enough to run a goddamn sub underwater. That's sort of a pyramid type thing. But they were able to do it. And when you're able to dip underwater when you need to, if you can form this blockade, you can be out there 2,000 miles off the coast. You know where these shipping lanes are going to be. And actually, it was the September 5th, the HMS Pathfinder gets sunk by a U-boat. And they said it was like the first time a torpedo had ever been fired from a U-boat.
And this wasn't like, oh, it was out patrolling or anything like that. This thing is sunk off Scotland. So this is like, oh shit, they're getting us close to home at this point. Also, submarine warfare and the term U-boat, underwater boat, is much more appropriate for these types because it essentially is that. It's on the surface for most of the time and then it can go underwater.
I didn't know what a U-boat meant. I didn't know what the U stood for.
It's not underwater boat, but it's under something,
Yeah.
and it's like it's the
Yep.
German word for underwater boat. But yeah, first time you're ever seeing this, so you don't have a method of counteracting and fighting submarine warfare at this point. So Britain spends a good chunk of this war from a naval perspective trying to essentially solve the U-boat problem of being like, fuck, how do we like find these things, or how do we defend against them, and how do we keep these merchant vessels from getting sunk? So this is a problem they're trying to figure out for a majority of the war.
What sunk the Pathfinder? I don't know. Well, who else was in the water?
I
I
don't
don't
know.
know.
And be like, it looks like the hit came from underwater.
Was it
They're
a
like,
mine? No, wasn't a
Nope.
mine.
They're like, do you think they're using? I thought we had the only submarines. They're like, fucking apparently not. Just to kind of spread this out to know why this is already considered a world war. On August 29th, New Zealand occupies German Samoa. So Britain is already mobilizing throughout other areas. They are calling some people from these other colonies to Europe to fight, but then they're also leaving those to then invade other territories that are held by who essentially they're at war at this point.
Yep. Australia takes Samoa. New Zealand takes New Guinea. Japan actually takes a holding that we'll get to in China that was in German hands.
Yeah, like the German fleet was there. It was German harbor.
And we'll talk about kind of just bouncing in and out of Africa and all that kind of stuff when we get down there. That's kind of all lumped into a little bit of like outside of the scope of where this is all going on.
So on October 9th, and I apologize if this seems monotonous with me just naming off dates, but we just kind of have to go in order like this to explain kind of how the war progresses. So October 9th, the Central Powers actually control the capital of Serbia. So they moved into Serbia and they control, is it Belgrade? I think is how it's pronounced.
Belgrade.
But we could say Belgrade. I think it's the way that most people outside of the country pronounce it. On the 19th, this is what's going to be kind of a changing point for part of the war in Europe as we get to this thing called the Battle of, is it Ypres? Ypres?
This is the one where there's too many words in it or too many letters in
Yeah,
it.
YPRES. It's Ypres or something
Ypres.
like that. Ypres might be something like that. So this is in France. Essentially, after what Adam had mentioned, the Battle of Marne, is the Allies are now pushing the Germans back. So they're pushing them back toward Belgium, and the Germans get to this point where they have established these fortifications, behind their line. They get to that point, and now they're set up to defend themselves. Well, at this point, because they're already established, now all of a sudden you're running into an army attacking like an entrenched or defensive position and basically an established position. So this is where they're fighting each other, and you get to this thing called the race to the sea. And the race to the sea, if you're looking at Europe, let's just imagine, Paris is there. This is happening around the 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock position, kind of up toward the English Channel. They haven't gotten to the English Channel yet. These two, forces are squaring off. And so what they decide to do is they're trying to outflank each other, but they're trying to go north to do it. So they're racing each other and just moving their positions up further north and then fighting. And then they're flanking and moving more up north. They're trying to essentially beat each other to the English Channel so they can sweep around and flank them, but they both kind of reach that position at the same time.
That's what they were doing, huh? I didn't know if
It's
they
like a
were going.
leapfrog game. You're
Yeah.
leapfrogging behind your troops to move your positions.
Well, and if you could get that outflanking position, you weren't going to have to push it all the way to the English Channel, were you? You would just start encircling them and trying to bring that.
You would try to
area
get
back
troops
down.
behind them and then
Yeah,
encircle them
okay.
and bring them
That
back
makes
down.
way more sense.
Yeah.
I just thought it was like they were trying to get there for some reason, but it was just like they were stacking on top of each other.
Yeah. So this Battle of Ypres is basically the battle that takes place kind of up north, kind of near the English Channel after they've tried these outflanking maneuvers. 130,000 casualties on each side. So each one of these fucking battles is just taking these huge tolls, and it's because the advent of machine guns. This is the first time that artillery in war has been used in the amounts and accuracy that it has ever been seen within the world, enough to the point where I think they said that was it 60 to 70% of all casualties in World War One were caused by artillery.
Oh, it would have to be.
And the rest were caused by like just regular firearms and machine guns and everything.
That and then just the dire conditions that they found themselves in, because if you can't make an advance because the other side has a machine gun that's pumping. Before that, I just had this weird thought. How many bullets do you think were used in World War One? It's incalculable, right?
Yes, it's incalculable.
There's no
The
way
amount of
to.
okay, so imagine it from this perspective because I have not an exact number, but even during certain engagements, large scales, Battle of Somme, things like that, shells for artillery, there were over 1 million artillery shells fired, and that's
Ridiculous. The big
large
ones.
scale artillery. Like now,
Yeah.
just imagine a smaller like
Fired out of cannons.
an incalculable amount of bullets, mines, all that kind of shit. So this is where we get the start of trench warfare. The Germans are dug in on their side, and in order to essentially not let the Germans counterattack, the British and the French start to go ahead and build these trenches.
Crazy move. This the battle. World War One was the first battle, and I heard this a couple times. I thought it was pretty funny. That was fought below ground, below water, and above ground.
Yeah.
Like or in the air.
It was 3D. It
Yeah.
became a 3D war. All right. We're going to go into trench warfare a little bit just because it's so fucking fascinating. But before that, we're going to take a quick bathroom break.
Okay. Spring cleaning is here, and we have a solution to uncomplicate the cleanup. Smart Labels is a product that makes organizing clutter quick and easy.
All you got to do is go to Amazon, buy a pack of Smart Labels, download the app from your app store, and start scanning labels. It's really easy to log an item into the app by name. You can describe it. You can even take a picture of it.
When you need an item, pull it up on the app to find out exactly which container it's in. There's no more digging through every box in the garage just to find out it's in the first one.
I actually just used Smart Labels to actually find Mike Tyson's Super Punch-Out.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I could teach Soda Popinski who's the king. Again, just jump on Amazon, buy a pack of Smart Labels, download the app, and start organizing the right way. All right. Trench warfare. So trench warfare is basically just like it's a stalemate only in the sense of like gaining or losing position, but not in the sense of like people dying. So trench warfare essentially, it's just like it sounds. You're fighting from within established trenches. So you have one army on one side, the other army on the other side. Now sometimes these trenches, the front line, could be as short as, I think they said in some areas it was 30 yards apart, and then in most other areas it was like several hundred yards apart. The area in between would be called no man's land. Most people, you're leaving me in the trenches taking grenades. Like, there's sayings that still come out from trench warfare. No man's land usually refers to some place that you're not supposed to go. That's not a survivable place. And so this is where we get this is where we get the creation of these actual terms.
In a literal sense, no man's land was called no man's land because you weren't going to be standing up
No man would
straight.
survive in that land.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly. So from where they established the trench fortifications, both armies from the coast, they established them all the way down to Switzerland. And you're like, well, why'd they stop at Switzerland? Again, Switzerland's neutral, so no one's supposed to be going into Switzerland, so they don't need to worry about getting flanked through Switzerland.
If you missed the first 30 war declarations, Switzerland had declared their neutrality at least 3 times in the first 30.
Yeah. So it's a 350-mile front of trench warfare. These aren't just fucking ditches. They may have started out that way when they're trying to dig them through, but these had to be permanently defensible positions. And you get these trenches that are 10 feet deep, about 5 feet up on the front of these, and you had them built in layers of defense. So you would have the front line trench. Essentially, that would be where you could, observe the enemy from. That was where like all the barbed wire was in front of it to not allow them to get into the trench. That's where you had your frontline soldiers that were manning the front.
If you were going to try any sort of advancement during a battle, that was going to be like the staging area to send people up.
Exactly, it was the closest point to the enemy's trenches. Then back behind that, and it varied how far back the next set of trenches. This was usually hundreds of yards. So if you had to fall back, essentially, it wasn't like, well, we got this trench and the enemy just jumps over that one and then 10 feet later they're into the next trench. Because essentially, if you're also firing artillery, if you're that close, the chances of getting hit within those same ones is much worse. So hundreds of yards back, you would have another one. Then maybe hundreds of yards back, you would have another one.
I'm sure you also probably have machine guns sitting in between these trenches that are being
definitely.
run.
the farther back they went is where they were to establish more of like the permanent artillery positions
Yeah.
because they were farther back. They weren't going to get hit directly from the front. So you would have like concrete pillboxes and bunkers and stuff like that along like the second and third lines.
If you're prairie dogging this, you could get hit from both sides depending on where the shells were coming from.
Oh yeah, definitely. And so like you would have the soldiers in the front one at the front line ready to attack or ready to repel an attack. The back one would be essentially like probably command.
Yeah.
Also probably some staging areas to get to the front. And in order to get to the front ones, they also had, if you have the trenches facing each other along lines that are parallel to each other, the other trenches to get to those would be like perpendicular to that. Think of it as a T, and then they would connect that way. So you'd have to go down those and then get to the front trench.
It was kind of like a maze.
Yeah,
is
exactly.
Really what it was.
Yep. And then further back, you would have another one that was like your field hospital. That would be where you were receiving supplies, is your furthest back trench, where it would be out of maybe artillery range or out of sight to where you would be bringing up all your supplies, which would then be transferred to the second and third trench. These were, eventually these got to be these guys' homes. It's where a lot of these guys were living. You would have areas that were dug out underground. The Germans were apparently much better at this, about establishing these positions.
They were good at establishing them, but as we'll see later on, the French figured out how to go deeper and more effective.
That's true. So like the Germans would have like dug in supported like bunkers for like barracks and things like that. The Allies would have something similar, but not to essentially how elaborate and everything it was, or had kind of the creature comforts. But learning this trench warfare system came with a lot of like trial and error. Things like sewage that they didn't really consider because they didn't maybe think that they were going to be here that long term. It had to be established that there were certain protocols in draining of sewage. So like they would have the trench and then they would have like a line of boards or whatever materials that they could get to support the front of it. About 5 feet up, they would have this thing called, was it the shooter's step?
That you could peer out over
The
onto
gunner
the edge.
step that would get you high enough up to the top of the trench where you could fire from. And then this is where you would get up to stage to go over what they call over the top to go and charge at the enemy. Behind that layer of wood, they would have like these essentially like gutter type things that were supposed to drain the sewage. They didn't work.
No,
really
because it's all flat. You don't build it with a pitch either way.
It's not only that, but you're making low ground.
Yeah.
And you're not making low ground in these areas that are perfect for trench warfare. You're making them in what they considered in Europe. In the World War II episode, we mentioned the lowlands.
Yep.
The lowlands were essentially the ones that were closer to sea level. Everything drains toward that. And so you're essentially making ditches in which water would then all flow, run off and everything, to where they had to develop a system where they had to have the bottoms of them lined with like boards that prop them up to where they weren't just submerged in water the entire time, because you get this thing that's discovered called trench foot. And trench foot is what happens when these guys were essentially standing around with their feet in water and mud for long enough times that the skin would actually begin to
dissolve.
You would get it if you've ever been in a fucking hot tub and you forgot you were in there for 3 hours and you get out and your skin's all white and it feels soft and like you could almost like peel it off. This is what was happening to these guys' feet because they were in here for so long.
Well, yeah, and imagine that's just a hot tub. Imagine being in socks and then in boots that just traps all that moisture so tightly against your skin, but there's still almost enough of the air element being around to make that warm, to make that cold. The differences in temperature that it's all facing against your skin.
Well, and think what happens too. That ain't clean water. Man.
No. There's
It's
a lot of
mixing with
microbes around there.
sewage, and also the corpses that are out in no man's land, people getting killed, all of the water draining off of the fucking decomposition.
Probably some semen from the tougher guys.
Probably. When you're sitting with that and you have your feet are essentially getting to the point where there's skin opening for wounds, all that bacteria is just flowing into those wounds. So it's a fucking horrible concoction of fucking nastiness here.
That skin ain't scabbing. If you got a cut, it's going to be open the entire time.
When you tend to get a lot of dead bodies and stuff like that, what's something that you tend to attract?
Rats.
Rats were such a fucking issue because of the amount of dead bodies that they were able to gorge themselves on and feed on, that the rats grew ROUSs, I think is how they describe it, rats of unusual size or rodents of unusual size. These rats were fucking huge. One story that stands out to me is this new guy came in that was with the British Expeditionary Force, and one of the guys was kind of showing him around where he's going to be sleeping, showing him the front line of the trenches and everything. And he goes to, at night, turn in, and he shines his flashlight or his torch over onto his bed, and there are two rats on his bed fighting over a severed hand that they had dragged in from the battlefield. What do you...
I'm not sleeping there.
Here's the other thing, too. Like, these guys, a lot of them are not trained soldiers. They've never seen anything like this before. There's nothing that can prepare them. Like, these guys grew up in fucking England and France, and they never thought that they were going to have to experience this type of, like... I don't even know what you call it.
Did you see some rats in the sewer in France? Yeah. You weren't foreign to the rats. You were foreign to the size and then the fact that they were munching on a human fucking hand.
And that they had a taste for human flesh at that point, apparently.
Yeah, it's...
Man tastes good. I want to get me some more man. And there was never a lack of bodies for these things to feed on. One thing I found, did you hear about the bathroom flies?
No.
Okay.
I'm glad I didn't, but I have a feeling we're going to hear about it now.
So to help control sewage, you would have to have areas where you would have to go away from the front in order to, like, shit. What would happen, and I'm sure they put a fix to this or tried too quickly, because it was an open air hole where they were just leaning over and taking a shit, all the flies that would collect there and everything, in areas in which the Germans were close enough, when someone went to go take a shit... You know, when you come upon a bunch of flies and they all scatter and fly up into the air, there were so many of them that it would create a signal, and you could see the flies fly up. They would know where their position was and be able to launch artillery on those positions. So they had to even adapt the way that they were taking shits because it was attracting enemy attention and causing deaths, to where they had to start... I don't know if this was the advent of it, probably not, but they had to start putting, like, enclosed toilets and all that kind of stuff. Now, as far as how long these guys were on the front line... There were, I think, 10-day, it was 10-day rotation, so you would serve 10 days on the front line. You would then move back to the next level for 10 days in more of a support role. You would then have 10 days back at either the third level of defense, or a lot of the times that you'd be sent to, like, a local town that was back behind the line to where you could kind of rest and recuperate. A big thing, and it's always been something with war, but, like, PTSD. Yeah. Or what was known back then as what they considered shell shock, correct? Because this was the first time that they'd seen artillery used in such an amount that the way that soldiers were reacting with hardcore PSD from seeing people blown apart and everything, they connected the dots and like, well, this started happening when they started using artillery, so it's shell shock, and there's some type of condition that's caused by being around these blasts that's making people, what they say, like lose their bravery.
Yeah, just basically your fight or flight kicks in, and flight is winning that 10 times out of 10 because you don't know who to fight. And this, throughout this whole throughout this whole understanding of trench warfare, this was something that I thought just was a simple fix. I would have built these trenches so wide that you were able to do a lot of shit in between them. I believe usually the average depth of them was like 7 feet. Just to give yourself room to live in these. If you're going to make them a home and you're going to have an area, you want a little bit of room. But why was that a bad idea?
The bigger you make these things, the bigger the target.
Yep.
It is. So what they did, and they had to, again, how many people had to die while they're learning these lessons is an insane figure. But when you're digging your trenches, essentially your first inclination is to be like, let's dig them all in a line so you can travel down it and everything like that.
And they did. That was how it started.
And they did. Well, what that does is when artillery is able to zero in and hit that sweet spot to where their arc of fire then lands in the trench, if you have a straight line going across, all that guy has to turn around and do to all the artillery down the sides of him is being like, dial it in for this, and we're going to hit the same distance, and we're just going to decimate this entire line of trenches. What it also does is when you had people that were actually charging and going up and over, because you would have these charges that you fucking see in movies where the commanding officer would blow a whistle and he would stand up and they would all climb out of the ladders and he would charge with, he'd hold his sword up in the air and they would all charge across no man's land through barbed wire and just get mowed the fuck down by machine gun fire. You also had these things that the Germans called stormtroopers, not to be confused with the Star Wars stormtroopers that couldn't hit shit. These guys were basically, I kind of want to compare them akin to like, almost like Viking Berserker
A little bit.
type
Yeah.
things, where these guys would charge across, like, or do sneak attacks at night, small groups. They would sneak into the enemy trenches and basically just cause havoc, killing people in their sleep, destroying as much as they could, and then they would sneak back across. They weren't trying to, essentially, it was terror tactics. They weren't trying to, like, conquer or, like, occupy these positions. They were basically just trying to psychologically fuck with the enemy and cause some casualties at the same time. Also,
The way that those are built, too.
if you get in the trench,
Yep.
you have two machine guns. One of you points down this way, one of you points the other way, and you fire as far as the fucking. And these things, I think, had an accuracy range up. They said to 1,000 yards or 1,000 feet.
Probably, yeah.
And so you're just firing down these straight trenches. So they eventually decided and learned that you have to make these trenches in almost a zigzag pattern, to where the depths of the trenches were changed to where you couldn't zero in on them with artillery fire. And if someone did get into a section of trench, they were able only to fire to a certain length or degree before the trench cut back, and you would able to be set up defensive lines to go ahead and meet them when they had to come around a corner or try to attack that way.
Well, in the artillery, too, if you think about it, when an artillery shell hits the ground, it's not so much an explosion because they were solid, there would be a shockwave that would be sent. And if it's sent down into a hole and that shockwave doesn't have anywhere to go, it's only going to go to where it's open. So once that artillery blast hits inside of that trench, all of the explosion and blast of that radius is going to shoot down the trench.
As far as it can go, that concussive damage. And that
Exactly.
shrapnel and everything that's blowing out has a direct line down each side.
So once it hits, if you're 60 feet away from where it hits, yeah, you don't get hit by the artillery shell, but you get hit by the blast, and that'll kill you just as much as the artillery shell. Probably even worse, too, because like you say, you're going to catch a piece of shrapnel and you're going to bleed out and die. You're not just going to die instantly.
Yeah. This area of no man's land, to certain degrees during this 4-year period, some of it is essentially, some of the charges do work when they catch them off guard, or they're able to load down enough artillery to go and cover like charges and everything like that. But for the most part, there in this section of northern France, there's not a ton of, I'm not saying there's not a ton of action, but there's not a ton of progress on either side. It's definitely, from a territorial standpoint, it's a stalemate, but just constant casualties.
Yeah. And to just go back onto the Eastern Front, kind of move out of something that I didn't expect to be as interesting, trench warfare, as it ended up being. To head back out on the Eastern Front, you had the Battle of Masurian Lakes that happened September 7th through the 14th. It was won by the Germans, and this is going to kind of be a theme because the Russians have so much land in Russia. Their retreat mode is going to be so much easier, to where the Germans are going to be able to gain a lot of land when the Russians retreat. And the Russians, just like we talked about, the best part about the three is you have naval warfare, you have army troops, and then you have guys. The guys in Russia, as soon as they lose, are going to start backpedaling and taking off. And this is pre the time of Stalin, where you weren't always punished when you retreated. This was still the czarist empire.
There was still some logic to it, to where you want to keep your fucking guys alive, even if they're retreating, because you still have to have someone to stop and try to fight.
Yeah, so within the first 6 weeks of the Eastern Front, Russia lost 1/3 casualties. 330, I believe it was like 330,000. So just short of 1/3 casualties in the first 6 weeks. Dude, that's a lot of death.
Is that 50,000 a week?
Uh,
That'd be 50,000 casualties a week.
And change. But yes, that's a hell of a lot of people to be losing. This is sort of where I was surprised, because I would think that there were certain groups that would be good. Austro-Hungary was kind of like Italy. They were kind of shit at fighting. They moved on Serbia August 15th, and again, this is kind of a flashback. At this Battle of Sur, the Serbs whooped their ass. They pushed them right back. So their next move was on into Russia. It was at Pizimzil, some shit like that in September. They're beaten again until the German reinforcements come in, and the German reinforcements block the Russian movements that were going to happen into Austro-Hungary. And this is where we run into the Ottoman Empire that declares war on Russia. And
how do they do it?
They start bombing ports on the Black Sea.
The Black Sea raid. So it's not even like they really are like, Russia, we're going to war with you. It was kind of like, we're going to do this and then we're going to kind of declare war. Or it's going to be the thing where it's like the Pearl Harbor thing where it's like, we declare war and it's as the planes are fucking flying in or as the ships are shelling it. So yeah, the 29th of October, you get what's called the Black Sea raid where the Ottomans basically inside the Black Sea. We talked about this kind of during the Constantinople episode, is you have Constantinople, which is part of the Ottoman Empire. You have to go through the Bosphorus Straits to get from the Sea of Propontis or Sea of Mamona. I can't remember exactly it was one of the two. I think they knew it as one name in ancient times in ancient Greece.
Yeah.
And then you travel through the Bosphorus Straits and then you get into the Black Sea. There was another way to get into the Black Sea. It was called the Dardanelles, and it was essentially not as wide or as easily traveled as the Bosphorus Straits, but it was still a way that you could get in there. And there's also some battles that take place to try to kind of secure the Dardanelles. But you have the Ottomans who are already there at the front of the Bosphorus Straits that can literally sail right into the Black Sea. And Russia has got cities on the Black Sea, and it basically just shells them from like some ships.
And at that point, the Russians are like, well, fuck, if you're going to do this, we're going to head some guys down there. So Russian troops moved to meet the Ottomans down on what's known as the Turkish frontier. I'm kind of talking about the macro, the zoom out of some stuff that we'd already talked about, but the overseas battles in the colonies just went nuts. The Germans didn't have nearly as many holdings down in Africa, but the Germans moved on to the Brits in East Africa. Allied forces had seized a place called Togo that was under German rule. That was August 26th. The Germans in Southwest Africa lose a battle to the British forces that are in South Africa. Japan enters on the Allied side that Chris had talked about. They attack German forces at a place called Singtu, November 1914. The German colonies at New Guinea were taken over, and Samoa were taken over, respectively, by Australia and New Zealand. The British forces they won. As Germany is coming through, again, on the other side, this is the craziest shit in the world. There were 4 cruisers that were lost, that were German cruisers, on the Falkland Islands east of South America.
Yeah.
So we've circumvented the entire world to where the Germans are losing ships on the east side of South America. They didn't just come down.
But they're losing them to, like, the British, who also have ships down there. So it fucking spans. And here's the other thing, man. How the fuck, like, I get it from a naval standpoint. Again, this is before fucking aircraft can spot ships and all that kind of stuff. So in order to know where a ship is, you have to physically be able to spot a ship like on the horizon and
no
stuff.
radar.
You are completely out in the vast expanse of the ocean. You're not just in the English Channel or around the Atlantic. You're out around South America, and you somehow run into, it's like that's the worst fucking luck. Like you run into a British fucking like task force, a British Navy task force, and you have no help anywhere around. You have no chance of getting back to safety if you get damaged. And so pretty much the only German sea power that's in that area is taken out after they lose that at the Falkland Islands.
You have to assume that they're probably sticking to shipping lanes, but at the same time, that's just the most unlucky thing to run into them. And you have, I believe it was 3 of 4, or no, they lost 4 cruisers, so they must have had 5 down there. That's a pretty big ship.
Little fleet.
Yeah.
That's a lot of resources to commit to stuff that's not even going to be helping you in Europe.
Yeah, it's just crazy that they lost that many that close to South America. The Brits realized that the Middle East was pretty important to them, so they just sent British troops down to seize control of a town called Basra from the Ottomans, and they did that pretty much to assure that the flow of oil coming from the Middle East to power all these big vessels that they had was going to be undisturbed.
So keep in mind, if you did listen to the Lawrence of Arabia episode, we kind of discussed this, how the British, because they had holdings in North Africa, one of those was Egypt. So they had a sizable amount of troops in Egypt at the time and were able to essentially move, instead of being like, well, how did they move troops all the way through Germany and all the way through fucking Austria-Hungary? And then, no, they had troops already and they were able to sail people into the Mediterranean. So yeah, they sent troops essentially from Egypt, and that's kind of where you get Lawrence of Arabia coming in to try to create these groups of like tribes that are going to go ahead and harass these, and so that all takes place in the Middle East.
He's coming, man. He's coming, and I'm fucking excited for it.
You also have the Suez Canal that comes into play here during this war. Now, the Suez Canal is it's a man-made channel that goes between and actually separates Africa from Asia. Now, it connects not the Black Sea, it connects the Red Sea to the Mediterranean. Okay. Now, because India is a British colony, they are getting resources and troops from India that they are using. In order to do that, if you don't control the Suez Canal, you're sending them all the way around, is it the Cape of Good Hope?
I believe so.
In South Africa, and then having to sail them all the way up just to go ahead and get them to someplace you can use them essentially in France or in the Mediterranean even or something.
South Africa was extremely important to have control of for the Brits, I assume, because that's like the halfway point if you can't go through the Suez. Mm-hmm. So you have those ports down there to reload, to refuel.
So the Suez Canal becomes huge, and it's hotly contested the entire time. It stays in British control, I'm pretty sure, consistently throughout the time frame of World War I, but it's constantly being fought over because it's so strategically important.
Yeah, it's very, very important to that whole area and to the ecosystem down there, and I'm sure Great Britain having their holdings down there to be able to control it was probably a linchpin for them to be able to have more of a foothold in the Middle East because there was just so much shit going down there. December 1914, Austria-Hungary finally broke into Serbia and took Belgrade to just immediately lose it again. And after they lost it, each side had accumulated another 200,000 casualties. So numbers are just going crazy.
Serbia only has 4.5 million people. You can't fucking the fucking percentage of people you're losing is insane, and they can't fucking afford to do that.
I think they said it's going to come up, and I'm probably going to get this wrong. I think they said that Serbia lost, like in proportion to their army, the most losses from one country. Which, again, if you start out with 4 million and you lose a lot like that. And
that's just people. That's not your army. That's not fighting people. Just in case, they hadn't made their declarations known by attacking each other. Going back to November, in that month, on the 1st, Russia declares war on the Ottomans.
Oh, perfect.
After the Black Sea raid.
Yeah.
And then on the 5th, France and the UK also, they're like, well, fuck, if Russia's declaring war, I guess we have to declare war on the Ottomans. So on the 5th of November, that's when France and UK are like, fuck it, we'll fight them too.
They're in, we're in. The Germans started getting a little nasty at this point, and they began shelling the coastal towns in Britain on December 16th. Pretty fucked up move, but again, this is warfare, so they feel like to shell these towns that don't really have any sort of military use, it's going to shake some shit up. I think they said there was 135 civilians killed in these shellings of these towns.
The raid of Scarborough.
Is that what it was?
What they considered it. Scarborough and 2 other towns were shelled. The first British civilian casualties in war since 1609.
God damn, that's a good streak.
Yeah.
That's a really
not good to have broken.
No.
Almost a little more than 300 years later.
Well, and yeah, I guess the last opponent was Napoleon, who couldn't figure out how to get across, so that sort of makes sense.
On December 20th, you basically have this, it's called the Battle of Champagne, because it took place in the Champagne region.
Nobody's popping bottles after this one. No one's
popping bottles on this one. Now, the reason this is important is because since Ypres, what the British actually couldn't pronounce, I'm just going to call it what they called it, Wipers. Wipers is essentially that battle where it essentially established trench warfare because no one was taking any ground. This is the first Allied offensive since Wipers. So it didn't go how they wanted it to go. And in this first part of World War I, you're getting the Allies aren't looking good. they'll get a couple victories here. The Eastern Front maybe goes a little bit better, but Russia, or not Russia, Germany is just ready for this.
Yeah.
And so that didn't go exactly how the Allies would have liked it to go. December 25th, we come to a very interesting situation that takes place on the Western Front, in a section of essentially no man's land in the trenches. There was this weird kind of like, it wasn't universal throughout trench warfare or anything like that, but on certain sections, there were almost these weird agreements between the two sides that there were certain times in which they wouldn't attack. Like breakfast was usually one of them. There were designated times for like prayer and like church services in which they kind of had this weird agreement not to attack. These agreements were not exactly looked upon kindly by like the commanders and everything, but when the commanders essentially aren't the ones really putting themselves on the line for this, you can't imagine that like you're sitting there in the trenches, you're fighting possibly for someone that you don't agree with, or from a German standpoint, you're looking at this and you're saying, are we really fighting here because this guy killed this other guy's relative in a completely different country?
Yeah.
And now we're here getting the shit blown out of us and trying to blow the shit out of these other people. That doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. But war essentially is decided not by the populace, it's decided by very few people in high positions, and that's a really unfortunate fact and reality about this time in history, is that everyone else is just kind of along for the ride and at the whims of a few designated people.
Oh, buddy, I think that's just war in general. At
Yeah.
any point in time, I don't think that there's ever been a time where everybody that was fighting in a war was there because they wanted to rip the other side's head off.
Yeah.
And for this little kind of peacetime that they had for Christmas, where they exchanged gifts and they
winter
met
truce.
in no man's land, this truce. We're talking about this first French offensive at Champagne, December 20th, so 5 days. 5 days removed from losing 90,000 casualties on the French side. They were able to come out, exchange gifts, have a Christmas together. It's like the most human
Played
thing.
a football game. They
Yeah.
played soccer. They played a fucking soccer game.
It's the most human that war can ever get, to realize that you're both on different sides, but at the same time you bleed the same way, you die the same way. For the most part, I'm sure religiously you fall into the same stockings.
They say there's a trend that's not really talked about too much, and it involves many years after these soldiers have gone home from the war, and of course they're still carrying the scars physically and emotionally, that there is some type of weird pull that has them try to locate people from the other side that shared in the same experiences, and they're not going into with any anger or animosity or anything. They just have this shared experience that they want to discuss with this person, or have something to be like, hey, like, I didn't really want to fight you, or after this time of my life I thought about it and what we were doing didn't make sense, and how we just blindly almost had to follow these orders that we were doing to try to kill you. And so I thought that was really cool. That also took place in World War II, where people would kind of, go to other countries, veterans going back to Germany and talking to soldiers that took place in similar battles or the same battles, and they have some type of weird shared camaraderie, not about being enemies, but about almost being in the same position of just kind of being meat for the grinder, or pawns on a chessboard.
Pawns is a very good way to describe it. And really, I mean, I would say this is probably before. There was certainly propaganda that was held during World War I, don't get me wrong. But this was almost like the last pure. And again, God, I can't keep doing this, but World War II didn't take a lot of propaganda to figure out that the Nazis were really bad people. But like you say, not all the soldiers that were in the Nazi army were the worst people imaginable. A good portion of them were, but not all of them were. But we see so much now that propaganda plays into thinking that everybody on the other side of a war is a monster.
Well, and Britain was the propaganda machine during World War One. After the rape of Belgium, the propaganda that they came out with really helped steer essentially the direction of public opinion about Germany.
For probably good reason. I'm sure they did some
I'm not saying in a
stuff
bad way,
Belgium.
but what I'm saying is that a situation that may have not been widely as known.
Yeah.
They took a spotlight and showed, fucking put that directly in the spotlight. Unfortunately, this whole winter truce thing wasn't something that carried over to each subsequent year of the war. As soon as command got wind of what this occurred, and this didn't take place along the entire trench, there were just examples of this. There's one main example at a certain location, I can't remember, but this is kind of where the winter truce, like the story of that, is known from. But command basically saw that and was like, no, fuck that. And I think part of that was because you didn't want your soldiers humanizing essentially the enemy.
Yeah.
You had to dehumanize them, and by doing stuff like this, how long would it be before you had your soldiers being like, no, fuck this, we don't want to do this anymore, and all the soldiers say, fuck this, we don't want to do this, and all of a sudden on the other side of the trench, those soldiers turn to their commanders like, fuck this, we're not doing this anymore. You guys have a problem with it? Take it up with fucking all of us.
Yeah. Well, and I'm sure the Germans are like, the French have really good cigarettes. They gave us like packs of cigarettes out there for Christmas. We're not going to shoot at them. Like they were very nice people.
They gave us wine. We gave them beer. It was fucking amazing.
Perfect. Getting into January 1915, we're not that deep into this war. It's just we're not even, we got our toes in there. But January 1915, there were almost 1 million lives lost. So not casualties dead. Almost 1 million people dead by the end of by the beginning of January 1915. And that doesn't stop anytime soon, because January 19th, the Germans used 2 Zeppelins, kind of cool, to bomb Britain while the Brits just kicked their ass at sea.
The simple fact that Zeppelins were an actual war thing is fucking bonkers to me. But then you think about, Wright brothers, 1903, something.
Yeah.
So flight, not commercial flight, not anything like that, but the first time that flight had been accomplished was the Wright brothers at Kitty Hawk in 1903. We are only 11 years, now 12 years away from that. And although flight has been advanced, and of course, like anything else in the world, as soon as something invented, the first thing that people are going to do is try to weaponize it and apply it for military purposes. Zeppelins are still the main way of air travel.
And it's the slowest thing ever. Like, once they drop a bomb, you have so much time to watch that thing leave.
I know, and they could fly higher than planes could.
Yeah.
That were in at this point, so you didn't have to really, And planes were so fucking unreliable and so new that everyone's like, I'm not fucking flying in that. But these things were hydrogen gas, and eventually the Zeppelins became a no-go because of the advent of incendiary ammunition, to where they would fire these things at the Zeppelin. And if anyone knows the story of the Hindenburg, named after
PVH?
BVH or PVH.
PVH.
The humanity, you see the thing go up in flames. Yeah, that's because it's full of fucking hydrogen gas. So that happened a few more times during World War One, when this incendiary ammo was used against these Zeppelins. But they still did sail them across the fucking English Channel to bomb Britain.
Yeah, and it's the slowest way to do it, but I mean, you use what you have at that time. This is when the German retaliation is the U-boat blockade around Britain. The German winter offensive just absolutely fucks up the Russians, and again, they retreat some more. The Russians lose 200,000 men during this German winter offensive. They do have success against Austro-Hungary again. They take back that Przemysl, whatever, in March 2015. And Austro-Hungary's total losses reach 2 million by themselves. That's a lot to lose by yourself.
Well, when you're not able to communicate clearly with all of your troops, it's probably going to lead to some miscommunication. Also in January, so we're into 1915 now. We may kind of step ahead as far as dates. You're going to probably see the gap widen as far as the events, just because stuff's going to be popping off everywhere, and we just can't discuss it all, but we're going to hit some of the main points for you. Just to let you know what's going on over in the Far East. On the 18th of January, Japan presents China. They're already looking at China like they did in World War II. They're already looking at China. They don't like each other. They provide China with this list of 21 demands. I didn't look into what they were, but I'm assuming they were all ridiculous, and they involved China giving over territory to Japan. The 28th of January, the Ottomans launched their first offensive on the Suez Canal, and they actually fail. So thankfully, the Allies are still in control of the Suez Canal. The 31st, we get the Battle of Bolimov. Now, this is important because this is the first German use of chemical weapons.
I thought that was Ypres, April 22nd.
That is the first use of poison chlorine gas.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
All
so
right.
the first use of chemical weapons, and I couldn't tell exactly what it was, but this is Germany's first foray into a whole new level of deprived, fucked up warfare. There's a reason that chemical warfare is outlawed by pretty much every governing body in the world, the UN, the League of Nations, once it's formed after World War One, and it's because of what happens with chemical weapons during this war. Germany, I feel like the term "they're not fucking around" doesn't. They just escalate.
Yeah,
There's nothing. I don't feel like there's anything off the table for them, and we're gonna find out even more so on that. But it's like as soon as something is developed, and like, hey, this can kill people. There's not a thought process of like, is this too bad? It's just like fucking roll it out, get it to the front lines.
that's war, man. It's just war, plain and simple. We saw it with our boy, fucking. Oh, we just did him.
Hannibal.
The pots of snake. Yeah, Hannibal.
Yeah.
Firing the pots of venomous snakes onto the boats. We actually saw that when we showed up here and started handing off blankets with smallpox onto the
That's
Native
true.
Americans. I mean, it's
that's biological warfare of a different kind.
you just when war is happening and you see something like I'm sure the trials were probably not on humans and they realized what happened when they would inhale this gas and like, ooh, what are the downsides of this? Well, we don't have to be very close to spring this on anybody. The wind might be a factor, but the results are just too good to pass up.
Yeah. Well, Germany steps it up again on February 4th when they go to unrestricted submarine warfare, which basically means prior to that, they were only going after military targets. At this point, they are like, well, that's not really working out for us so far, so we're just going to be fucking hitting everything. So they basically designate a zone around Britain, which is a very, very large fucking zone, and basically state that any ship, merchant, civilian, pretty much anything that's coming into this zone is aware that this is an active war zone and that they're not responsible for being, the Germans aren't responsible for them getting sunk.
Yeah.
So, unrestricted warfare. February 19th, we get a little thing called Gallipoli.
Yeah, and that's the lead into this is pretty incredible because the Brits and the French send troops down to try to harass Constantinople at the Dardanelles, I believe is what it's called. Yeah.
Yep.
And once they get down there, Turkey goes ahead and is like, hey, nope, we're good. We surrender. As they're trying to get into Gallipoli, they end up losing 3 battleships via mines.
They try to make a run through the Bosphorus Straits to get into the Black Sea.
Bad choice. Real bad choice.
And they just get hammered by artillery and by mines from both sides. With Gallipoli, Churchill at this point, good old Winnie, he is the first Lord of the Admiralty.
Parliament member or like a cabinet position? Probably cabinet position.
Cabinet position. Yeah. He's in charge of essentially the Royal Navy. So his plan, and Gallipoli is kind of Churchill's baby. If you haven't gone back and listened to the Winston Churchill episode, I highly suggest it. He's a fascinating fucking character.
Yes.
But they don't really think, again, the Ottomans have been known as essentially the dying man in Europe. Churchill's looking at this and saying, this is going to be fucking easy. We're going to sweep in here. They haven't seen anything like us that's coming into this show of force. We're going to land on the Gallipoli Peninsula, I think it is, and we'll be able to march our troops, establish a beachhead, and march in to take Constantinople.
Not a bad plan.
No, not at all, especially based upon, I guess, what they knew about the Ottoman strengths. Well, they vastly underestimated, essentially, the Ottoman strengths as far as their defensive fortifications, because although Gallipoli does last, and this is actually a campaign, it's not just the Battle of Gallipoli, it's the Gallipoli campaign. Although this thing does actually last for a while, it goes from February 19th, and Gallipoli doesn't end until the evacuation on December 18th. So this thing takes almost a full year, but they don't really make any headway. They don't get Constantinople, they don't secure any of their objectives. And because of this campaign, Churchill actually loses face. He's removed as First Lord of the Admiralty, or does he resign to join the military? I want to say maybe he steps down from it just due to the pressure and how it
I thought he
looks.
got so much shit for it. They said it was like political suicide, but as we
He
know,
was probably asked to step aside or they
yeah,
were going to fire him in one of those situations. I can't remember. We discussed it during the actual Churchill
yep.
episode. But then he actually joins and goes and serves, I think, as a major somewhere in the British Expeditionary Force before he ends up coming back. This is his what they consider his wilderness years.
Yes, that's right. That's
Yep,
what it was called.
just like Teddy. March 5th, we get the France and United Kingdom. When they actually go and they're doing the Gallipoli campaign, they're needing Russian assistance to do this because if they're invading from this direction, the Russians are coming in from the north, Constantinople, and the Ottomans have to actually divert their forces. They have a higher success rate or chance of success. Well, in order to entice Russia into helping them out here, they're like, hey, check it out. If you help us do this, you get Constantinople. You get that port city right there on the Bosphorus with access to the Black Sea. You get to control access to the Black Sea, and you get a port to go ahead and ship out to the Mediterranean.
The jewel of the Ottoman Empire.
Yep. And so Russia's like, cool, I'm in. And then the 18th is what I was talking about when they lose those 3 ships trying to run the Dardanelles, I think. April 22nd, we get what's called the Second Battle of Wipers. It's the one in northern France. This, buddy, you want to talk about this? This is the first use of the chlorine.
Yeah, the Germans had set up on their front line these gigantic canisters, and they must have waited until they got a favorable wind. They launched the chlorine. The chlorine gas ends up penetrating into these trenches, and chlorine gas, it just basically will burn any sort of mucous membrane that you have inside your body. So as you're inhaling it into your mouth, into your nose, or anything like that, any sort of soft skin is just being disintegrated by this chlorine gas. Very effective. It worked out super well. It killed a ton of French. But the issue was the Germans didn't have the backing to take on any of the land that they had just gassed. So they couldn't actually move forward. So it was kind of like they did it, but once it worked, they're like, holy shit, it worked. What do we do now? Oh, we can't really follow up.
Yeah, well, we didn't expect that to happen. Here's the thing, too. Chemical warfare had not been a thing in widely used in warfare. And so gas masks weren't really a widely distributed thing. And if they weren't very well looked into as far as what they could. They didn't know about some of these chemicals, so they didn't know what the gas mask did or didn't work. Also, these gas masks are like the one you see in fucking creepy movies where it's just the 2 circular eye holes and would be fucking near impossible to actually see out of.
No, you can wear it and it might protect you from the gas, but you just basically put a blindfold on your face.
Here's the other thing, too. At this time, apparently, if you were in the military or even a man and you didn't have a mustache, you were like a fucking pariah in society. And what ended up happening, because of this chemical warfare that took place within the trenches and everything, everyone started shaving off their fucking mustaches and facial hair because the gas mask couldn't seal to their face. It actually happened to our fucking favorite person, Adolf Hitler, is he was actually in a gas attack during World War II and had a mustache and then fucking, like, that's why in World War II he didn't authorize, the one thing that he fucking did that could even be looked at in a positive light was he didn't use chemical weapons.
On the front.
On the field, yes.
On the field.
I was going to say that. You beat me to it. I saw that twinkle in your eye.
Do you think that's where the little mustache comes into play? Was he realized that that was as much as he could keep?
The documentary I was watching, so it shows I didn't know, it doesn't tell you it's Hitler.
Yeah.
It's just a German guy. He can't seal it, and so after he survives the gas attack, he goes and he shaves the sides of it off, and then it shows him looking into the mirror with just the tiny mustache. And I was just like, it was that realization where I just go, it was the Leonardo DiCaprio's finger snapping, pointing at the TV, like, whoop, whoop.
Hitler.
I was just like, oh, that's who that is. So they launched this gas. It basically, the only thing the Brits can do is fucking evacuate the bunkers and get the fuck out.
You gotta beat the cloud. You gotta run from the cloud because you're not surviving in the cloud.
So during this second battle that takes place over a number of days, if not weeks, the Brits actually lose 59,000 for casualties to the German 35,000. So a little under, or a little less than half of what the fucking Germans lose.
Jesus.
But fucking another notch in the escalation of war has been put up there. We're now using chemical weapons.
It's disgusting but effective, and I think we talked about it in doing research. It's so wild. It's too much of a wild card to use
There's no precedence.
well, that, but also, like, it's a very risky move to do that because a change of wind and all of a sudden you're gassing yourselves. If you're carrying one of those canisters out to the front and a machine gun pierces it,
That's the
it
other thing I was
blows
thinking
up.
too, is to pump that much gas to be that effective, it had to be on a wide swath.
Yeah.
It had to be dispersed in a way to where it could reach. They're not just walking it out into no man's land and be like, don't shoot, and then they're like chucking canisters. They have to have a dispersal system. That's all near the German lines or in the German trenches. On the off chance that they launch an artillery barrage and fucking hit those and just gas the entirety of the German trenches, it's definitely risky.
Well,
It's-
and I'm sure it's all flammable too. I'm sure chlorine gas is flammable. So if you hit that, you just basically intensified that artillery shell from just shrapnel into a bomb.
big event happens that's not super war related on May 7th. And I don't know if most people have heard about this, probably not a younger generation, but if you've ever heard the name the Lusitania, the Lusitania was a passenger ship that on May 7th, it was actually sunk by German U-boats. Now, there's a lot of information that when this first happened, the way the propaganda spun this, and it was essentially like a British or American ship. I think it was mostly it was British ship. There were how many Americans on it? 120?
128.
128 Americans on it, and how many people actually died?
1,198.
Okay, so almost 1,200 people died when the Lusitania was sunk. 128 of them being Americans, currently a country that is sitting out neutral in this war. That right there, because it was part of the unrestricted warfare, that perked up the ears of the American public even more than they were already perked up regarding this European war, and they were like, okay, hold on. What the fuck? Like, you guys are fucking torpedoing passenger vessels now, and not only that, but ones with American citizens on it. Now, on the trying to stay biased in the scope of history, the ship itself, when the propaganda came out,
Unbiased, you mean?
I'm sorry, unbiased, yeah. When the propaganda came out, it was that it was strictly a passenger vessel. It was all innocent
Yeah.
civilians, all that kind of stuff. Enough to bump it up to make it, as horrendous as you could. Come to find out, there were actually arms and armaments on the ship that they were using to send over to Britain. And so, while it was a heinous act because it was a passenger ship and was very obviously like in the same vein as Titanic, looked like a passenger ship. It ended up being torpedoed and sunk. So America is fucking outraged for that. The world is outraged for it because it appears on the surface to be strictly a terror attack against a bunch of civilians.
A lot of terror attacks happening right around that time. To go back just a few days, I think it was April 24th, the Brits decide to send in the Australians and the New Zealanders to continue their move to Gallipoli after the first kind of raid didn't work out. They send them back in.
Send in our psychopaths. Our beautiful psychopaths. You guys know we love you down there. We want to come visit, but
Oh, fuck yeah.
when they saw something not working out, they're like, we got to send these crazy outback bastards in and see if they can fuck shit up.
Yep. And I think they did. The Turks were so concerned about it that they actually went out to meet them. And while they were doing it, they started the Armenian genocide. They started deporting Armenians to oh God, I can't remember what the desert is. But they said that the Armenians that were living inside of Turkey were consorting with people that were against them. Obviously, this was just made up to try to get rid of the Armenians. They took them, marched them out into the desert, and left them there to starve and die. The numbers range anywhere from 1 million to 2 million Armenians that were marched out there and killed in the desert. To this day, for some reason, Turkey's still like, well, it didn't really happen that way, and technically what we did wasn't a genocide. Very much a genocide, and very disgusting that they did it that way. There were advances to the east by the Germans, and Austro-Hungary starts to push back the Russians' victories. They ended up taking 100,000 Russian prisoners. So again, the amount of prisoners that they take, where are you housing 100,000 Russians?
I know.
Like, well, what are you doing with that? And I'm not in favor of killing them because I'd rather them be prisoners than killing them. But
100%.
it's got to be a headache to take
Your head
100,000
from
prisoners.
a logistics standpoint of trying to visualize what 100,000 people would look like in a group, and then at the same time be like, well, what football stadiums hold 100,000? There's some college stadiums that are close to 100,000.
Big house in Michigan, I think.
Big house. So you take everybody there. You have to then house them, feed them, put them inside some type of shelter, and construct all that kind of stuff. So it's kind of hard to fucking wrap your head around the fact that like these people were being treated with any type of like fucking dignity.
Zero dignity.
Probably wasn't a large like set of bylaws about how to treat prisoners or anything like that. That'll comes with like what the fucking Geneva Convention, Treaty of Versailles, that kind of stuff with treatment of prisoners.
You ate when they had enough food for you to eat, probably pretty much.
May 23rd, Italy finally perks up and they're like, okay, guys,
These fuckers. God damn it.
Okay, we're ready. And they declare war on Austria-Hungary.
This pisses me off so much because Italy does something that I just want to beat my head against the wall. They entered the war, like you said, June 23rd with the first battle of Asonsu. Asonsu happened 13 times.
The 12th Battle of Sun Tzu. The 13th Battle of Sun
What the
Tzu.
fuck are you doing 13 times against the Austro-Hungarians and you're just
gotta
not
wonder,
winning?
What is so important about Sun Tzu?
Oh, well, I don't think it was so important. I just think that it was like the first, like the closest area that the Austro-Hungarians and the Italians were meeting.
Fight somewhere else.
Yeah, both of them were just so bad at war, though. They're like, well, I guess we'll call this one a draw. Or, hey, we'll say you won, but guess what? 6 months later, we're going to run, or 3 months
See you
later.
at the next one?
Yeah,
See
exactly.
you at the next one.
It blows my mind that you would do the same war 13 times in a row. But, well, Italy is keeping this is the one thing I'll give Italy with this. They're keeping the Austro-Hungarian Empire busy.
Mm-hmm.
They're always attacking. They're always trying to keep them on edge.
Here's the thing, too, is Austria-Hungary is kind of like the Italy of World War One. As weird as that sounds, they're fighting Italy, but they're actually the Italy of World War One. And what I mean by that is they're not very good at what they're doing, and Germany has to fucking keep sending resources and troops to try to basically like help them win. And so it's just like they're fucking losing again. Great, send more people down there. So they're having to also pull resources. So another player getting involved kind of in the south of Europe is definitely a positive because now you're pulling more resources to have to fight Serbia, and now you have Italy in there fighting on the side of the Allies.
Yeah, and the biggest thing that happens during this time in June and over the whole summer is the Germans take air superiority. And we say that, or I say that now, we were just talking about Zeppelins dropping bombs.
Mm-hmm.
So air superiority is going to play a big factor in this because air superiority has never been an issue in any other war that we've had to go through.
Oh, my friend, I love this topic so much.
Yeah, I knew that this was going to be something to get you hard, and that's why I didn't want to lean into it too much, because as soon as I said air superiority, I just want you to take it, because it's incredible.
A little bit. So, initially, when the war pops off, France has the largest standing. There's never been what's considered an air force before.
Before you get into it,
Okay.
we discovered flight, you said 1904?
I think 1903.
Somewhere around there.
Yeah.
We're in 1915.
Yeah, we're 14 years.
Yeah, 12, 14 years, something like that, into being able to put humans in a contraption and send them up into the air.
And here's the thing, too, is flight was still so niche, and it was so out there away from what traditional warfare was, that pretty much every country attempted to go ahead and look into the military applications of flight. Some invested more in it than others. But what the traditional part of the military looked at it as was a waste of manpower and resources. They didn't understand essentially that what cavalry had done in warfare for the hundreds and thousands of years before this is cavalry was not only a fighting force, but they were also the scouting force to try to gather information about the enemy movements. You now had the ability, and these first planes were fucking scary as shit to even think about getting it. I think they were something like 40 horsepower. They were just little like 6-cylinder engines, which you got to think like the engine is probably not that fucking old at this point either.
No.
And now you're putting it on a plane where there's no carburetor or fuel injection even sniffed on the horizon. It's all gravity fed, and you're putting it in a position where you're going up and down, manipulating, and still expecting these engines to work. These planes were usually just the little single wing planes that were a wooden frame with stretched fabric over it.
They were sails.
They were sails in the air, and they were so light that when wind would come up while they were parked on the runway, the planes would shift back and forth, catching the wind just by sitting on the ground.
Well, it's like I told you we were researching. Aerodynamics were at such a primitive stage.
There's nothing before it. There's no precedence to how do you design something. It's all just everybody being like, okay, we know it has wings. It's got to have an engine. Okay. What now? What then? Well, what else does it need? And it was just trying to take things off the ground and then being like, that one crashed. Why do we think it crashed?
And there's no curvature on any of these things. They're just boxes up into the wind. Mm-hmm. When you put a flat surface into the wind, into airstreams, all that airstream does is just play against that flat surface.
You've never had to worry about the concept of aerodynamics. You've had to worry about the concept of maybe hydrodynamics with designing ships that can go faster. Aerodynamics is a completely foreign concept. And so these first planes would go about 60 miles an hour was their max speed. You drive faster than that on the fucking freeway. And these are where these planes are flying. So how it initially worked is these things were used strictly from a surveillance and information gathering role.
Highly important.
Oh, insanely important. So you would essentially have these planes take off. You would have your pilot who actually sat a little bit further back. And then in front of the pilot, more so over where the wings were, is you would have your... not co-pilot because they wouldn't be flying, but you would be having your, I guess, navigator / engineer / photograph taker who would essentially have a big fucking camera. And as you're flying over, and again, they're open cockpits, they're not sealed, no oxygen masks. These things maybe get up to, I think, 3,500 feet, I think they said, and it took them 6 minutes to even climb up to that. And that was as high as they could go. So I'm guessing they're not flying that much because at some point during the war, I think they said that it was 50-50, right?
Yeah.
The survival rate for pilots was 50-50.
Well, and you got to think you're not getting high enough to need oxygen.
You're not. But at the same time,
enough.
You have to be looking at it as a perspective. It's like, if I'm up that high and it fails, I'm going that far down to crash. If I'm this low and I start to crash, I'm this much closer to the ground and maybe my survivability. Because parachutes were kind of an early thing, but no one fucking trusts them because the flight itself, the concept of that, you probably had to be a little batshit crazy to even jump in a plane to begin with. But then you add on the concept of being like, well, you can jump out of this thing in the air and you'll pull this and this thing will open up and you'll float safely down.
You're not high in, I think you pull your chute at like 7,000 or 8,000 feet when you're jumping out of an airplane. Like you're not high enough off the ground to pull a chute and have it do anything.
When they were doing research after they developed the parachute, again, this is not just an application of like pilots can jump out of the plane and be saved if they use this parachute. It now got to the point where it's like, maybe we can send guys purposely out of the planes with these parachutes and land them behind enemy lines. During the war, this is when the invention of the static line came in, where you would attach the line to the plane, and it would pull it as you jumped out, so you could jump out at lower altitudes.
You probably tethered your camera to the surveillance guy up front, right? Because if you get up there and you drop the camera, you're useless.
So here's the thing. Because of the position of where he was sitting, he almost could not take pictures until they were in a very optimal, insanely dangerous position. So the pilot, they said most of the time after a few missions of discovering that the pilot up front had to be like directly over the target to lean out and take these pictures, he's like, we're getting fucking fired at this point when we're this close. So but half the time he would be like, get the fucking camera ready, pass it back to me as we're flying over. I can control the plane and take the picture, and then I'll give it back to you and we'll get the fuck out of here. These things don't have guns mounted on them yet. These are strictly surveillance. Well, what happens is the enemy starts having airplanes. And as you guys are passing each other in the air, it's just like, what do we do? Like, you just flip them the bird and be like,
oh, man.
Hey, what's your name? Tell me. You can't do anything. So pilots start arming themselves with pistols to try to have pistol fights in the air. They have a method of using some type of grappling hook that they hang off the plane,
I
trying to
like
hook
that.
the other one.
I like that a
and
lot.
just damaging it enough or pulling it off enough off course enough to where it can send it into a spin.
If they're made of fabric, if you hook that hook into fabric, it tears, and you don't have any sort of.
But your plane weighs nothing either.
Yeah,
And
true.
get
If you
stamped
hook
on
onto
something,
it, it's going to pull you off course too, huh?
Exactly. And they would arm their like camera guys with like rifles, but they also couldn't fire anywhere in front, so you had to wait till the plane was moving alongside you and then try to take off a few pot shots at it.
Well, and that's the funniest shit in the world too, because you have to worry about very little things when you're firing a gun on the ground. But when you're up there, if you fire a bullet into the air and there's a strong gust of wind or a stream of air or something like that, you could fire it directly at him. It's going to hit 70 feet towards.
There's
not hit, but it's going to zing past.
Concept of leading your target of like travel of
chance.
anything like that. You're trying to scare them with the sound. Is basically what it is. It's the idea of you're getting shot at more than the actual threat of getting hit.
Well, and what did those fucking Germans figure out that we didn't figure out first?
So the Germans end up figuring out, and this is the first time that it occurs, July 1st of 1915 was the first aerial victory with the synchronized gun-armed fighter.
They figured out magic.
I don't understand this. I don't get the concept. I've read about it, and I still don't understand it. It was
About
called the interrupter gear.
Yes, I thought it was the disruptor gear, but interrupter gear sounds right.
Might as well be.
Yeah.
It's disrupting my fucking brain just thinking about it. So they figured, of course, the easiest way to hit a target is if you're aiming down the sights, but to aim down the sights, you're firing directly into the propeller. Before the interrupter gear, they tried this method out, and what they did is the propeller was made of wood. They put metal on the back of the propeller itself, and they would try to fire, and it would sometimes hit the propeller.
Perfect. Ricochet.
Probably
That
didn't
sounds
take
good.
that many times for either a ricochet or hitting it enough times to where it actually got through the metal and broke the propeller, and you were fucked. So the Germans figured out fucking sorcery and invented this thing called the interrupter gear, in which they synchronized the machine guns on the plane with the prop to where it would fire through the gaps in the prop while it's rotating. Those things are going fast enough to fucking carry an aircraft into the sky where you can't even see them. And you somehow design something that is synchronized with both the engine and the firing of the guns in order to only fire during the gaps in the prop rotation. I don't fucking understand it. I don't. It's fucking witchcraft.
It makes you kind of mad too, huh?
Well, I don't. So you figure it out, but then how long does it take somebody else? I mean, eventually the
Yeah.
British and the French do figure it out. There's been some theories that they actually had to back engineer it by capturing a German plane or a couple of them, and seeing how the engine, like, because when you're crashing these things, it's destroying mostly everything.
It's made of wood.
It's basically at the front, it's a big chunk of metal for the engine,
Yeah.
and the rest of it's made of wood and fabric. And so when it goes down, it's the big heavy metal part first, and just diving it and destroying that shit into the ground.
I guess if you need to find something, if it's a piece of steel in there and interrupter gear, that'll be the one thing that you probably find.
You're just fucking digging in there trying to find it.
Yeah.
Well, this was an insane game changer because now, where the Allies don't have the ability to defend themselves in the air, basically you do have the Germans taking complete air superiority until they figure out a way to do the same thing and are able to defend themselves. Once that happens, you then get the advent of dogfighting, where aerial combat actually happens.
Yeah.
With aerial combat, you do get, at the beginning of the war, the French have the largest fleet of planes. They're not armed or anything like that. The British have a bunch, and then the Germans also have them as well. During the war itself, I think what ends up happening is a few years into the war, the British are actually producing the amount of planes that they had at the beginning of the war on like a weekly basis,
Nice.
because they realize how strategically advantageous from a surveillance standpoint. Like, you can fly over and see troop movements. You can fly over and see enemy weak points or strong points, discover gaps in their lines. There's no limit to the use that these planes provide this fucking new era of warfare. They use them for artillery sighting. They'll be flying in the air over these battlefields and be watching the fall of shells. They have to, of course, there's no radio, so they're sitting there making fucking notes on a map and shit about where these things are, where they think they're landing. They have to turn around, hope they don't get shot down, fly back, land, and be like, this is where you guys are hitting. So it's not exactly like the changes and alterations are quick. It's probably like, okay, remember yesterday when you guys weren't hitting anything? Try this today, and I'll get back up in the air and see where these shells are falling.
And that's if you landed. If you made it back is then when you can pass on that information.
But I mean, it completely adds another element, and one that in World War II is almost going to be the main form of warfare is going to be aerial bombing. The planes, as they progress, because they see the usefulness in them, they start to get bigger. If you wanted to drop any type of bombs early on in the war, they weren't bombs. You were literally just holding a bucket of grenades. And as you flew over a trench or something like that, you had your co-pilot pulling the pins and just dropping fucking grenades out to try to land them. These planes got bigger. They started having guns mounted on the back where you would have a co-pilot that was able to fire.
A tail gunner, is that what they're called?
Tail gunners. You would have the advent of biplanes, and then even on the German side, you would get triplanes. If anyone has ever heard of the Red Baron, not the pizza, but actually the guy on the pizza box who's it's named after, he was a World War I flying ace. And to become an ace, you have to shoot down 5 enemy planes.
We'll get to them, yeah.
Yeah. But you had all of a sudden these people who had become kind of rock stars. They almost said that the pilots were almost like the new wave of knights. How people looked at knights because they were going up, their planes were their suits of armor, they were having one-on-one battles, they were said to be more chivalrous and had like a code of conduct and everything. But yeah, they were looked upon like they were almost rock stars. Plus, man, like those guys looking at them like, do you fucking have a death wish?
That's, I think, where that crossover happens, is you have like the Steven Tyler pilots that have to be a little crazy, but they're just crazy enough to, if they land and they live, they're just gods among men. Yeah. And you're going to get a lot of popularity just... the thought of flight is already so foreign that it's like, okay, now you're killing people in the air and you're landing? Like, holy shit. Yeah. This is pretty fucking cool.
Yeah.
So yeah, to exit out of air superiority, we'll get back to it because it comes back when the good side ends up regaining that superiority. Germans take Warsaw in Poland, which is a huge loss for the Russians on August 5th. The Russians again retreat, and once they retreat, Tsar Nicholas is like, fuck you. Our military is making a mockery of our country. There's a lot of uprisings, so Nicholas is like, I'm taking over military command. Single biggest mistake that Tsar Nicholas makes, because the Russians don't get any better under his command, and once you take command of the military and the losses start coming, if you're the leader of the country, there's going to be some people looking at you even more.
You're now solely responsible. Yeah. You have no one else to put the blame on. And, I mean, what are the chances that a guy that's been put into power through total hereditary means is going to also be a military genius as well? Yeah, it's not going to be a very, very likely. We get to September 1st. Now, this is a little bit of a change because America pipes up a little bit. There's an incident where in, what was the date of the ship of the Arabia?
The Arabic?
Yeah, the Arabic.
Shit, I didn't write down that date.
Oh, yeah, you go. Okay, so a German U-boat, prior to this, a German U-boat actually sinks the SS Arabic, killing more Americans. And finally, the United States is like, hey, Germany, you need to knock this shit off. And Germany looking at this and being like, I'd rather not risk this, bringing this into the war. So they actually suspend on September 1st of 1915. They suspend unrestricted submarine warfare after the United States kind of gives them a warning about it. We get to October 3rd, and a new guy actually doesn't really enter the game, but we get the Allies landing in Greece. Now, Greece hasn't really done anything as far as like saying, hey, we're on this side, but they do essentially allow the Allies to land in Greece to essentially move troops in to support Serbia, who's being at this point now attacked by both the Ottomans on one side and then Austria-Hungary on the other.
I'm sure the Greeks saw Serbia as the buffer zone between them.
Well, 100%. Like if they take over this, there's nothing between us. And then we're kind of little down here.
We've had enough of being taken over in history.
We've seen this. Yeah. We've seen this movie before. So they end up landing and having allies kind of in their country. So they have a little bit of an advantage at that point.
And this whole idea was called the Great Autumn Offensive. And it attempted to take the pressure off of what is a crumbling Eastern Front in September. The offensive cost France and Britain another 250,000 casualties to Germany's 147, so they're still stacking bodies while Germany's kind of slower behind them. Like you said, October 3rd is when the Allied troops land in Greece to boost the Serbs. And then we see Bulgaria jump in on the side of the Central Powers. Bulgaria is to the east of Serbia. And when they get in there, the Serbs really don't stand a chance because they're fighting on two fronts. And
Bulgaria is right between where the Ottoman Empire would be and Austria-Hungary.
I think isn't it like the turd of the butt cheeks?
It is. They're sitting right there kind of in between them. And so from their standpoint, I mean, I'm not sure what the reasoning for them entering in, but I'm sure they looked at both sides of them and they're like, you know what? Since these guys are also here to support me down here, there's no other real allies. So if I take Serbia or help them, then maybe I'll get a chunk of this as well.
Well, and just like the victors writing history, we don't know if Bulgaria was promised land in Serbia from Austro-Hungary or anything like that after the war is over. This is where things really go south in Serbia. In 2 months, they end up losing a third of Serbia's army is killed. So that was what I was talking about, where I said by like sheer numbers and population size, they get blown away.
Well, when this happens, pretty much everybody, I'm not going to go through the individuals, but everyone is just like, all right, so everyone good? We're declaring war on Bulgaria, and everyone declares war on Bulgaria. So we've got a new player on the field. Things are just fucking crazy all over Europe and all over the world at this point. This is kind of what we consider would be the halfway mark, is when the Bulgarians come in. So I think that's probably a good spot to end the episode.
Yeah, and then we can come in on the ending of Gallipoli.
There we go. That'll let you guys know how long Gallipoli has lasted, because we've talked about all this, and now when we start the next episode, Gallipoli will be being evacuated.
It's a fun story, too. It's a good way to start.
Yeah, definitely. All right, man. Got anything else?
No, excited to get into the next one.
All right, guys. Well, thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you on the next one. You're not going to want to miss it.
Peace.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for joining us for another episode. If you like what you heard, hit that subscribe and like button. Follow us. If you didn't like what you heard, still hit that anyway, because we'll probably cover something in the future that you do like. Please follow us on our social media. Adam, hit them with it.
Our Instagram is historically high pod, historically high pod, and we are on Twitter at historically high. That's historically HI.
All right. And if you guys want to send in any feedback, suggestions, hit us up on those two, or you can even do it on Gmail. It's historicallyhighpodcast@gmail.com. Thanks again.
Peace.